Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Lost His Quirk After Becoming #1? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. It was all the same with young Bakugo and young Midoriya, two souls. One dream. The dream to be pro-heroes essentially both idolized All Might wholeheartedly. Sure, they had different perspectives on such an inspiration: save to win, win to save, etc. Two souls. One dream. Both got into UA, the top school for heroes, top in the hero course. Pushing to be their best, thriving to surpass the other. Time skip 15 years after graduating from UA. 15 years later, Izuku Midoriya, former #1 pro hero before his quirk dwindled from life just as it did to All Might when he had chosen Izuku as one for all successor, thrived as a teacher at UA, making the best of the situation and guiding the next generation. It was the second best option after his dreams of being a hero was shattered. It was good while it lasted, was a thought that always crossed Izuku's mind. Izuku's perspective. Izuku had changed a lot, no doubt about that. The wimpy, wide-eyed kid many once knew was long gone. Grown up, battle-worn, and scarred, his features bore the history of everything he'd endured and overcome. Bittersweet emotions followed at the sight of those marks. Some were sharper and harsher than others, but each one carried its own painful memory. He had cut his hair shorter. He carried himself differently, a confidence Izuku had always possessed, but had never truly embraced until the ripe old age of 18. Ri-yin-ning-gi. Izuku's All Might-themed clock screeched, silenced immediately by a harsh slap of his calloused palm. Izuku's day had begun, albeit at 9 a.m. Sitting groggily on his bed, nestled comfortably under his weighted blanket, he groaned slightly and reluctantly stood to his feet. Practically dragging himself to his closet, he grabbed a white-collared button-up, dress shoes, a blazer, pair of ridiculous All Might socks he still wore, and finally, a random tie. He picked a different one every day, each printed with a different hero. Today's pick? Could have been All Might's Bronze Age, Silver Age, or Inspiring Golden Age. Hero galore. Taking a faint glimpse into the depths of his closet, he was greeted with the sight of his old hero suit retired and carefully hung. A flicker of nostalgia flashed through Izuku's mind. Though the loss of his quirk was rather recent, it felt like centuries ago. Throwing on his clothes in a minor rush to get ready, he looped the tie around his neck, smiling slightly to see it was Ground Zero's print Katsuki's. The orange X-Grace tie added a bit of flair to the rest of Izuku's work clothes, providing a touch of sophistication in contrast to his blazer. Izuku stumbled into the kitchen, slipping a dress shoe onto his left foot as he hopped slightly and gripped the counter for support. Choosing to neglect the otherwise unruly hair so uniquely his, he clambered around the pantry and cabinets in search of a mug, of course, an All Might one, gathering his ingredients like a 5-star Michelin chef. Or rather, a 3.5-star average chef. As he prepared his coffee, he drummed his fingers across the countertop anxiously. He'd grown quite addicted to caffeine. It fueled his drive to work with fewer breaks and meet deadlines, often acting as his sole lifesaver. With a faint beep of the coffee machine, a vigorous gulp of his drink, and a few seconds of scrambling for his house keys, Izuku's workday began. Walking to work, like usual. Izuku lived 2 miles away from the school, so he'd walk there every day. It was mid-fall, the leaves were turning and falling, multicolored trees enveloping his surroundings, his senses filled with the hum of autumn in all its glory. Civilians bustled about their day, everyone tightly bundled in sweaters and coats. His gaze wandered, wondering how his surroundings might be different if he were still a hero. Maybe more lives could have been saved. Maybe more villains caught. Izuku reminisced about his past, but it didn't make him sad. Regret lingered, sure, but who doesn't have regrets? His scarf felt a little too tight. He tugged at it absent-mindedly, lost in thoughts of the past, the future, and all the could-have-beens. Occasionally, Izuku would be met with the faces of loyal fans who still had faith in the man, despite his retirement as a hero. He never felt entitled to the attention, but once in a blue moon he'd get recognized for his feats and triumphs as the high school first year who had ended the paranormal liberation front at the cost of his quirk. The embers of his quirk, which once burned bright, managed to cling to life for many years, allowing Izuku to finish high school at UA and squeeze in a few years of heroism before finally hanging up his cape. Izuku had retired only 10 months ago from heroics to pursue education, expanding his horizons a bit, as well as utilizing information that would soon rot away in the depths of Izuku's mind to pass on to the next generation. Rambling on and on mentally, a habit that had grown to replace his verbal ramblings, which often terrified people, or at least made them uncomfortable. He spiraled in his own thoughts. He often paused to chirp a small good morning to passers-by he recognized. Strolling wistfully in a notion, Izuku may well have blocked out an explosion from his blissful train of thought. "Ayan, funny you should say that." As if on cue, none other than Katsuki Bakugo flew past Izuku, popping out of an alleyway in front of him as he was in hot pursuit of a villain with a speed quirk. Gliding with minor turbulence from his own explosions, a wolfish grin, and the drive to arrest the villain, Katsuki swiftly pinned the villain down. Sprawled out on the road, luckily empty, the villain lay face down under Katsuki's right knee, which was pressed to the villain's nape, while his left leg stamped down on the villain's legs. His hands pinned the villain's wrists behind their back, effectively immobilizing them. Cheers and applause sounded. After all, the new #1 hero was at work. Though often feared, Katsuki still had public acceptance. With that, the flicker of oh-so-familiar red and blue lights beamed, scooping the villain into the cop car after efficiently placing firm emphasis on them. Katsuki briefly took a gander of his surroundings, gaze falling flat onto a once intimately familiar mop of unruly green hair. 15 years later, Katsuki Bakugo, currently the #1 pro hero, was a top-ranking figure in the hero world. With every update to the hero billboard chart, Katsuki either climbed past a few names or, as had been the case for the past 2 years, until Izuku's retirement, held firmly at second place. Sure, Katsuki had ambitions to be #1, however, he was pretty damn happy just being at Izuku's heels. When Izuku retired due to quirk loss 10 months ago, a quiet emptiness took shape, a lack of triumph, of valor even. "Not like this," Katsuki muttered under his breath as he reluctantly watched the news report, a large headline glaring across the screen. "#1 pro hero Deku retires. Could this be what costs our nation its stability?" Stay tuned for more. With a furious scowl, he spammed the off button before hurling the remote at the screen. He was finally #1, but at what cost? He had imagined he'd always be chasing Izuku, right up until death parted them from their shared dream. But now, it was over. The dream short-lived. Katsuki's perspective. Izuku wasn't the only one who had changed. Katsuki, despite having a similar grumpy attitude to that of his high school self, he had grown, and at minimal grew to be a better human. Waking up bright and early, or dark and early, the sun hasn't even risen yet. Katsuki was up and running. It was 3 a.m., ever being the light sleeper. Katsuki awoke at the sound of his phone alarm clock, flicking the alarm to off as he basically launched out of bed. Only in his usual black sweatpants and boxers, of course, he briefly glanced at the stitches on the left side of his chest, just above his heart. A mild reminder of the pain he faced in the war, how he was privileged to be breathing, a major lesson learnt after losing his life once. His hand instinctively grazing the tender, scar-ridden skin. He huffed slightly, brushing off the guilt that still clung to him, knowing his life had cost most of Edshot's body. The hero who saved him using his quirk, spreading his body out like paper-thin thread to stitch the gaping hole in Katsuki's heart shut, only for Katsuki to remain unconscious for another hour. Grumbling under his breath, he pulled on his warm hero costume. First, his winter-modified jumpsuit tailored to compensate for his heavy reliance on sweat to use his quirk, followed by his boots, gauntlets, neckpiece, and the rest. Scrambling to his kitchen, he simply grabs a protein bar, his keys, and left. Beginning his day steadily with a morning run, doubling down as one of his patrol hours, taking advantage of the humid air of the early morning. Katsuki ran in his hero costume, sweating tons due to the warm suit and the humidity. Just what he needed for the rest of the day when things get cooler and it's harder to store enough sweat to use his quirk efficiently. On this run, things seemed all clear, the neighborhood quiet, having tons of spare time. He ran to his agency about 9 miles into the city. Greeted by his secretary and the janitor who practically lived at the agency, he made his way to his office. With a brief sigh, he started tidying things up. Stacks of paper Katsuki needed to sign were jumbled across his desk. Organization had never been his strong suit. He scrambles for the key to the lowest drawer in his desk. Gathering the papers in one of his hands as he unlocked the drawer, he left the stack in the corner of his drawer, the never-to-be-seen-again drawer. Anything he refused to sign, or was just too dim and lazy to sign, was shoved into this little cubby. Honestly, even with a secretary who was supposed to do all this bullshit for him, he still got handed mountains of paperwork. His secretary, or as he called her, Shredder, got the nickname after an incident one night at the agency. Katsuki had come in late to chill in his office and toss more crap into the drawer when he caught her shredding documents. The sound annoyed the hell out of him. Obnoxiously loud. So obnoxiously loud. Hence Shredder. But she was good at her job. Dim and good, actually. She spared Katsuki from about 80% of the paperwork he'd otherwise be stuck doing, leaving the last 20% for him to figure out on his own. He clearly didn't do shit. A faint knock on his office door made him pause mid-rummage, shoving stacks of paper into the drawer like his life depended on it. Yeah. Katsuki cleared his throat nonchalantly, pretending he hadn't just been stuffing important documents to be forgotten. Shredder's soft voice called through the door. "Ground Zero, sir, there's someone on the line." Katsuki glanced at the agency landline. Sure enough, someone was on hold. With a reluctant sigh, he muttered, "I'll pick it up. Jot down anything important if needed." Shredder nods, "All right, sir," and scurries back to her desk. Katsuki picked up the phone just as the call transferred through. "You rang." The guy on the other end muttered, "I know it's early, but there's been a disturbance. Some guy with a speed quirk's tearing around Kamino Ward." Katsuki nodded. "All right, I'll send some cops over." Even as the #1 hero, he still got calls like this minor crap from time to time. It wasn't much of a surprise when calls like these turned out to be basic complaints or reports. He put the guy on hold and dialed 110, the emergency number in Japan. Almost immediately, a woman answered, speaking quickly, "Hello, what's the address of your emergency and what's your emergency?" Katsuki, already used to the system, responded just as swiftly. "Got a complaint about a guy speeding around Kamino Ward with his quirk, should be visible from afar." The woman nodded, though of course not visible on the call. "All right, we'll send 2 cop cars down." Katsuki hung up and took the guy off hold. "2 cop cars on the way, sir. Feel free to call back if necessary." He hung up again after hearing the guy's confirmation. Then, without missing a beat, he went right back to rummaging, shoving papers into the drawer like there was no tomorrow. About an hour later, after cramming random documents and letters into the never-to-be-seen-again drawer, he finally managed to clean his office. By now, it was around 6 a.m., the time most heroes either got to work or started patrol. Limelight heroes, at least. Katsuki worked both shifts, probably not even considered legal. He covered the underground hero hours 3 a.m. or earlier to 6 a.m. and the Limelight hero hours 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., leaving him with only 4 to 6 hours of sleep. A proper sleep schedule? Yeah, that was out the window. With crime rates constantly shifting, so did his hours, but it didn't affect Katsuki much. Not like he even used those few hours to sleep. No, he'd do anything but rest. Working out. Reading, a habit he picked up after being forced to read in high school. Honestly, just staying active. If he was still alive and kicking, then he was doing something. His train of thought was interrupted once again by the unpleasant ring of his phone, a call from Red Riot, or rather, Ijiro Kirishima, a former classmate of his. Most likely calling to ask if they could patrol together. The phone rang several times as Katsuki glared at it, clearly annoyed. He absolutely hated collaborating with other heroes. The only person he ever tolerated working with was Izuku, not that that was an option anymore. Ijiro left a voicemail. Katsuki was FNG right. "Hey, Baku bro," that stupid nickname Ijiro had given him, I haven't seen you in a while, man. I was wondering if you wanted to patrol together? Well, if you're hearing this, have a good day and at least consider it. Katsuki groaned. He really didn't like working with other pro-heroes. He preferred to work alone or with Izuku, point blank. Izuku provided a challenge no other hero posed. After a bit of internal debating, he decided to just say he was busy. Heroes always had some random sheet to deal with, either piles of paperwork depending on how good or sheet their employees were, or D-list villains that could be taken down in seconds. He replied to the voicemail with a text dry as ever. Busy. You too. Almost instantly, another notification chimed. Okay, thanks man, smiling face. Aijuru responded fast. Katsuki rolled his eyes, a soft huff escaping his lips. Just then, another call rang on the agency landline, not even bothering to pass through Shredder first. The same number from earlier caused the phone to sing. He answered just as smoothly as previously. The familiar voice from 3 hours ago came through, hushed and nervous. Sir? I need help. Katsuki's perspective. Sir? I need help. The man spoke voice a breathless mutter as if the guy had been running. Katsuki's brow furrowed slightly, reluctant concern creeping in. He asked in his usual gruff tone, now edged with urgency, All right, what do you need help with, sir? After a brief pause on the other end, the man replied, his tone shaky. Ground Zero. Remember the situation earlier? The guy with a speed quirk in the Kamino ward? Katsuki scoffed lightly. Yeah, I remember, he huffed. The man continued, voice trembling with each word. I was on a morning walk with my daughter and he took her from me. Please help. Katsuki didn't care for most cases, but this one was different. Something about it disturbed him. The idea of a young girl being taken like that. It hit somewhere uncomfortable. Katsuki quickly responded, his voice sharp, on my way, leaving no room for any response as he hung up. With that, Katsuki rushed out of his agency, not bothering to do as much as explain why his sudden departure. The moment he was in the open, he blasted into the sky, traveling midair with swift, sharp explosions, eyes scanning every corner of the city for any sign of the villain or his hostage. Then faint yelling. A young girl's voice. Katsuki's focus snapped. He changed course immediately, following the sound. The fact that he could even hear her said a lot. She was close. Which meant he was close. As soon as he caught sight of the villain, the girl tucked under his arm, Katsuki doubled his speed in pursuit. The guy might have had a speed quirk, but Katsuki was already on his heels. The second the villain glanced back and saw him, the hostage became dead weight. He tossed the girl aside like she was nothing. Katsuki dove, catching her in his arms, and without stopping, handed her off to the approaching cops. His eyes never left the villain. He was back in motion before the girl could even say a word. It was almost like the girl was bait used just to grab the number one hero's attention. Katsuki made a mental note of that, useful later to figure out what this BSTRD wanted. Barely noticing how narrowly he had missed running into a civilian, Katsuki was on the villain, arms and legs coordinated in a single, fluid motion as he slammed him to the ground. The villain was pinned, face down on the asphalt, wrists yanked back and locked into cuffs. Katsuki handed him over to the cops without a word, then looked around for any more signs of chaos besides the red and blue lights in which flickered brightly. Cheers and applause sound, ignored as he searched, only to be met with the sight of Izuku's all-too-familiar figure for the first time in the past 10 months and approximately 3 weeks. Yes, he had been counting, as if he'd ever admitted out loud. He observes for a second till their eyes meet. Rah, they finally meet again. Greater than over equal to less than over equal to. Izuku's perspective, Katsuki's perspective? Izuku's breath hitched ever so slightly. It hadn't really been that long since he'd last seen Katsuki, but it felt like ages. 10 months was the longest stretch they'd ever gone without contact. His thoughts snapped back to the present as their eyes briefly met. With a small smile, Izuku took in the sight of his friend. Katsuki carried himself differently now, with the weight and authority that came with being number. He noticed how Katsuki stared at him for a second, those sharp crimson eyes searching for what? Izuku wasn't sure. Maybe for a reason why Izuku was standing there in a suit, wearing a tie with Katsuki's hero emblem printed across it. Katsuki narrowed his eyes, gave him a brief glare, then started walking over. Izuku smiled warmly as Katsuki approached. "Hey Katsuki. Long time no see," he chirped. Katsuki hums in acknowledgement as his eyes dart across Izuku's figure. "What's with the suit, big shot?" Katsuki quipped with slight curiosity. Though they used to be nemesis thanks to the fierce, unspoken competition that defined most of their time at UA, the two were now friends. Back then, it was always about who could rise faster, fight harder, win louder. Whether it was top scores, combat trials, or recognition from All Might himself, they constantly pushed each other, sometimes to the brink. The two were friends now, though it took time for Katsuki to recognize aloud, albeit it being a reluctant confession. Izuku responds with a familiar hum one Katsuki had gotten used to over the years. "Yeah. It's been a while since we last talked," he says, offering a small smile. "I've been teaching the hero course at UA, actually." Katsuki gave a slight nod, glancing at the tie with a quirked brow. "Makes sense," he said, then added with a faint smirk, "and the tie." His voice dipped just enough to poke fun, not push. Izuku let out a quiet laugh, a little sheepish as he reached up to adjust it. Izuku recomposes himself, offering a lopsided grin. "You know I'll always love heroes, Katsuki. I grab a random tie with a different hero's print every morning. You just got lucky today," he says with a chuckle. "Don't let it get to your head." Katsuki raises a brow slightly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Got lucky, huh? DMN coincidence. Or maybe even fate finally cut me some slack," causing Izuku to roll his eyes just a little. For a moment, Katsuki tilts his head in slight confusion, his mind drifting back to when classes at UA usually started. "Hey, if you teach at UA, doesn't that mean your shift started?" He pauses to check his phone for the time. "About 6 minutes ago?" Izuku tensed, briefly checking his watch, just to confirm Katsuki wasn't teasing him. "I am late," he thought as he saw the time. Looking up at Katsuki as he blurted, "Hey, it was nice seeing you again, but I'd like to not lose my job, yeah?" he says as he gives a slight wave and starts running to UA. Katsuki smirked, cupping his hands around his mouth like a megaphone and calling out loud enough for Izuku to hear, "Get to work, teach." His voice carried through the quiet neighborhood streets, causing a few heads to turn. Whispers spread quickly, everyone noticing that it was, in fact, Izuku Midoriya, the former #1 hero, rushing to his post. Katsuki watched with a satisfied grin, clearly enjoying the moment. That was until people spotted the current #1 hero. Katsuki tensed, anger flaring at the thought of getting swarmed by fans in the next few minutes if he didn't haul butt out of there. With a sharp explosion, he blasted into the air, dodging the crowd. Some tried to chase after him on foot, but Katsuki caught up to Izuku, letting himself drop to the ground and landing right beside him, sprinting alongside. "On second thought, I'm crashing your class today. I'd rather not deal with interviews right now," he called out over the noise of his explosions as he followed Izuku. Izuku let out a bark of laughter as they ran side by side, the sound echoing lightly in the morning air. "All right, just don't blow up my classroom, yeah?" he called back with a grin, eyes flicking toward Katsuki as if daring him to try. Katsuki offered a rare smile, one reserved for Izuku only. "Bet." His tone was light but carried that familiar edge of challenge, the kind only Izuku ever seemed to bring out in him. He shot Izuku a playful glare, eyes gleaming with mischief, as the two approached the ever-recognizable gates of UA High. The sight of the campus brought back a rush of memories, battles fought, dreams chased, and a friendship forged in fire. Katsuki scoffed lightly, crossing his arms. "Let's see if those brats can handle 2 legends in one morning." Izuku snickers as they traversed through the check-in to enter the school. Izuku flashes an ID and casually mentioned that Katsuki was there to give a lecture to his class. "He's with me, here to give a lecture to my class." The staff didn't question it, probably too stunned by the sudden appearance of the #1 hero to care. With a quick nod of approval, they were let through. Izuku glanced at Katsuki with an amused grin. "See? Easy." Then, without missing a beat, he turned and began leading him through the familiar halls of UA, hands tucked in his pockets as he muttered, "Hope you're ready to scare some first years." Noticing the familiar route, Katsuki raised a brow, already a little suspicious. "Don't tell me," he muttered as they rounded the corner, and sure enough, there it was. The bold, Class 1A, sign hung right above the same massive door, like it hadn't aged a diamond day. A flicker of nostalgia crossed his face, quick, barely there, but real. All the memories hit at once: fights, friendships, dumb drama, sleepless nights chasing after the dream of becoming pro heroes. Izuku offered further confirmation with a casual nod. "Yep. The exact class we were in," he hummed, a soft grin tugging at his lips. After a brief pause, he pushed the door open, immediately met with the eager, concerned faces of his students. The classroom erupted with chatter, voices overlapping as they bombarded him with questions about where he'd been and if everything was okay. Katsuki stayed just outside the doorway, just out of view, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He rolled his eyes at the noise but didn't step in, waiting for Izuku to settle the chaos and give some kind of heads up before he made his entrance. The last thing he wanted was to walk into a room full of teens and get stared at like some DMN celebrity again. Izuku cleared his throat, the sound sharp enough to cut through the room's buzzing energy. The class fell silent almost instantly, half because of the tone, and half because they knew what that tone meant. "Listen up." "All right," Izuku started, adjusting his tie with a casual ease. "To explain my absence, I ran into an old friend of mine on the way here." He glanced briefly toward the doorway. "You might have heard of him. Katsuki Bakugo. Current number 1 hero, ground 0. That alone was enough to get a few gasps and wide eyes from around the room. "Nothing's wrong, relax," he added quickly, lips twitching at their reactions. "He just tagged along, so I expect you all to behave like semi-functional human beings. No shouting, no asking for autographs. He's not here to entertain you." He paused. "Unless he wants to." His tone was light, but the look he gave his class was the same one he used when someone forgot homework, teasing, but warning all the same. One of Izuku's students raised her hand, her head tilted slightly in confusion. Izuku caught the motion and gave her a subtle nod, a silent yes, that told her he was listening. She glanced toward the doorway, then back at him. "Why is ground 0 here?" she asked, her voice cautious, like she wasn't sure if the question was allowed, or if the number 1 pro hero was going to suddenly blow something up just for asking. Izuku let out a small chuckle, hands sliding into his pockets as he answered casually, "He ran into me on my way to campus this morning, figured he'd come along and dodge the crowd." He gave a light shrug, as if having the top hero in Japan crash your workday was normal. "So, yes, ground 0 is here. But no, he's not going to vaporize anyone unless you start slacking off." Izuku then continued. "Keep that in mind, yeah?" Izuku hummed teasingly, tapping his temple with one finger in a playful gesture. With that, he stepped aside and opened the door wider, finally allowing Katsuki access to the classroom. The headlights above the classroom illuminated his figure as he stepped into view, his presence commanding yet silent. As he gazed over the nostalgic classroom, the usual sharp glare rested on his face, but there was something calm beneath it, familiar, almost casual. The classroom went quiet as all eyes landed on him, tension and awe swirling together in the air. This is getting a little lengthy, so I'll extend this to the next chapter." Izuku's perspective, Katsuki's perspective. With the loud clambering of students scrambling to their seats the moment Izuku gave the call, the classroom filled with the sounds of rushed footsteps and the familiar creaking of chairs, almost like the seats themselves were sighing in relief as each student finally settled in. It was a kind of chaos that felt routine-controlled, but only barely. Class 1A had energy for days, and while they usually straightened up when Izuku stepped in, that didn't mean they were saints. The second he loosened the reins or cracked a joke, it was like lighting a fuse. Suddenly everyone was talking, laughing, teasing each other across rows. It was a mess. His mess. But one he'd grown to handle with the ease of someone used to weathering literal explosions. Katsuki's courtesy. A sharp clap from Izuku's hands echoed through the classroom, immediately snapping his students' attention back to him. Homeroom had officially begun. Even as their eyes shifted to the front, lingering stares of awe, and maybe a little fear, remained fixed on the figure beside their teacher. The respect in the room was palpable. Katsuki Bakugo, the current number 1 hero, radiated intensity. His presence alone was enough to hush even the most talkative student. It was one thing for them to be taught by Izuku Midoriya, the recently retired, once revered #1 hero. Many of them were still starstruck by that fact alone. But now they had both legends in the same room like it was just another regular Monday morning. This is reminding me of Teen Izuku, when he'd practically bounce out of his seat with that stupid expression like, "Holy F dash. It's all might." When he literally saw the man daily. Ringen equal to underscoring equal to. Izuku took a brief moment to admire the silence, his gaze sweeping across each student with a watchful eye. He cast a quick side glance at Katsuki, who stood beside him, also scanning the class with his usual sharp expression. Clearing his throat, Izuku hummed, "You decide you can sit wherever, Katsuki," he said calmly before turning back to his students. A lopsided smile tugged at his lips as he looked at the class. He genuinely enjoyed teaching. Katsuki settled into a vacant desk near the back of the classroom, arms crossed as he leaned back slightly, eyes sharp as they scanned the room. From here, he had a perfect view of both the class and Izuku, quietly observing. "All right, I'm guessing it's been a good morning so far, judging by the smiles on your faces?" Izuku hummed, amusement clear in his voice. The students all nodded at once, murmuring little agreements, still slightly stunned by the presence of the two heroes. The first to snap out of it was none other than Kota Izumi, a child Izuku had once saved during their summer training camp back in his first year at UA. Now no longer a child but a smart, sharp-eyed teen. He raised his hand just above the familiar hat with spikes, one he still wore even as a teenager. Izuku nodded at Kota, coaxing him to speak. "Yes, Kota?" Kota's eyes met Izuku's emerald ones as he opened his mouth to speak, curiosity tugging at his voice. "Mr. Midoriya, is Mr. Bakugo gonna stay the whole day?" he asked, his tone casual, but there was a clear excitement underneath it. A few heads turned toward Kota, some students perking up a bit more at the question, clearly wondering the same thing but too nervous to ask. Izuku's eyes danced to the back of the classroom to meet Katsuki's, the same question present in Izuku's gaze. Katsuki caught the meaning behind Izuku's glance and cleared his throat slightly. What's a day off?" "Might as well," he said, his voice carrying that familiar gruffness everyone knew him for. Izuku nods and gestures at Katsuki. "There's your answer, Kota," he replies lightly, his eyes twinkling with quiet amusement as Katsuki leans back in his chair. Kota, satisfied now, settles into his chair comfortably. Izuku hums. "Since this is just homeroom, do you have any questions for me or Ground Zero?" He pauses momentarily to correct himself, which, luckily, most of his students didn't look into. Another student, a girl named Yui Kisaragi, raises her hand, her small bracelet clattering softly as she does, catching a faint glint of the classroom light. Izuku, with a patient smile, nods. "Yes, Yui?" His voice light-hearted and casual. Yui sets her hand back to her side and remarks, "How do you know Mr. Midoriya?" She turns to look toward the back of the room, where Katsuki sat as she spoke. Katsuki averted his gaze from Izuku to Yui, stifling a chuckle behind his hand. Deciding to tease Izuku a little, he smirked and said, "I've known Izuku Midoriya since we were really little. I'm talking diapers and fire trucks kind of young." Enticing a look of mild shock and curiosity to be directed towards Izuku by many of his students. Izuku snickers ever so slightly, his cheeks tinged the lightest shade of pink from mild embarrassment. Having gotten somewhat used to Katsuki's teasing, he rubs the back of his neck and confirms, "Yeah, it's true." Katsuki adds in a slightly teasing tone one only Izuku recognizes, "You know, Midoriya's quite the nerd, unless you couldn't already tell. He's always writing down every single detail about every hero in those little notebooks. He keeps constantly analyzing quirks. There was even a page about me." He murmurs loud enough for the whole class to hear as a slight smirk tugged at his lips. Class 1A buzzes softly with whispers and murmurs, the students clearly intrigued by what Katsuki just said, curious about all the things Izuku must have written down. Izuku's cheeks still held a faint pink tint, just barely deepened, prompting a slight chuckle from Katsuki, something most weren't used to, as he quietly grabbed a key to the drawer at the bottom of his desk. He opened it silently and, with both hands full, slid out about 29 notebooks, sighing softly as he leaned on the desk. Happy? Yeah, I still have them. Most of the lesson plans I assign use these notes for structure. Katsuki chuckles as he glances over the stack, eyebrows raised just slightly. 29. And counting, he says, a smirk tugging at his lips. You've got more than that at your place, I presume? He hums, his voice still laced with that familiar teasing edge most weren't accustomed to. The students giggle quietly, some exchanging looks as they take in the sight of their nerd of a teacher and the towering stack of notebooks in front of him. It wasn't impossible to imagine their teacher as a younger Midoriya hunched over each one, scribbling away his thoughts and ideas on a random person's quirk like his life depended on it. Izuku lets out a slight scoff, not out of annoyance, but clear, quiet amusement as he shoots Katsuki a playful glance. You know damn well I have hundreds, he mutters, the corner of his mouth twitching like he's trying not to smile. Students stifle giggles as they glance back and forth between Katsuki and Izuku like a tennis match is unfolding before them, whispers spreading of the duo's dynamic and how Katsuki seemed to know their teacher very well. Before anybody could mention it, the bell squealed eagerly. Homeroom was over. Izuku, saved by the bell, clasps his hands together with a slight chuckle. All right, study hard. I'll see you in a few hours. Class dismissed. He gives a subtle wave as the students scramble to pack their things, making a beeline for the hallway and their first PRD class. Izuku stuffs his notebooks back into the bottom drawer, closing the drawer and locking it with the key. As the students dispersed, a calmer ambience settled over the room. A quiet sigh of relief escaped Katsuki, accompanied by the slightest hint of a smile. But the moment was brief, as another batch of students soon piled in for first PRD. Now wearing a slight frown, Katsuki stayed rooted in his spot, barely acknowledging the new students with even as much as a wave when they glanced his way. Ain, deal with it, Katsuki. You'll manage. As the students of the new PRD filed in, Izuku caught Katsuki's eye and shared a subtle glance. There was a quiet gleam in Izuku's eyes, sending a silent, unspoken message. You can still back out if you want. I'll come up with an excuse. Katsuki scoffs and shoots Izuku a sharp glare that clearly says, and miss the chance to tease you in front of your students? Not a chance. The smirk tugging at his lips only makes the challenge in his eyes more obvious. Time skipped to 5th PRD. Thus, a few hours passed. Non-stop questions about Katsuki's presence and teasing remarks from him nearly drove the usually level-headed Izuku mad. Still, he managed to keep his composure throughout all the hero history classes, eager to skip to the hero training class with Class 1A. What a change in dynamics. For once, the usually set-off Katsuki was the laid-back one, while Izuku, the reasonable, easily flustered nerd, was on the verge of snapping at some students. Izuku still acted like a nerd when teaching hero history, only now, a slightly passive-aggressive nerd, which Katsuki found strangely adorable. Finally, not like Izuku was playing favorites, he just knew the kids better. Class 1A was back for their hero training class. Izuku let out an audible sigh of relief. He smiled at the class tiredly. All right, I'll explain the instructions once we arrive at the "You change into your hero costumes, chop." Chop, he said, clapping his hands together, enticing a bunch of teens to scramble out of the room swiftly to get dressed in the locker rooms. Once the room emptied again, Katsuki looked up at Izuku with a curious expression, one brow raised, head lolled slightly to the side. Are you doing rescue training like we did at the USJ? He hummed as he stood to leave. Izuku nodded. Kind of. I'm the one they'll be saving, sort of like the HUC from our provisional license exam, he murmured, stuffing a few papers into his bag. Slinging it over his shoulder, he headed out alongside Katsuki. HUC stands for the Help Us Company, a large worldwide group of professionally trained rescues. They were assigned in the provisional licensing exam, where saving these people who'd feign injuries was the goal. Save to win. Do your best, Izuku. Carrot. Once everyone was suited up in their hero costumes, the class gathered outside the UA building, waiting for the bus that would take them to the USJ for their next training exercise. Izuku and Katsuki had the students lined up neatly as Izuku addressed them. For obvious reasons, both safety and ethical, I'll only explain what we'll be doing once we get to the USJ. So, just a heads up, keep your senses sharp, he warned. Also, Ground Zero will be assisting you all throughout the exercise. Katsuki spoke up, his voice firm and authoritative as always. Don't expect hints or praise from me, he said bluntly, eyes scanning the group. I might throw out the occasional tip, but only if I decide it's worth my time. The bus arrives, promptly parking in front of the class and expanding the doors open for the class to enter. Izuku allows the students to pick their seats as they board, sitting in the back of the bus to keep a watchful eye on the class in case of chaos. Katsuki sat beside him, his familiar crimson eyes examining their recognizable surroundings as he glances out the window. Once the bus settled, Izuku glanced over at Katsuki, who was quietly scrutinizing the view outside the window. He murmured softly, "Nostalgic, Hichin?" His eyes flicking across the empty environment. Katsuki briefly turned his head to glance at Izuku as if he hadn't heard what was said. There was a minor pause before he gave a slow, almost reluctant nod. Yeah. His posture was a little too stiff, shoulders held just a bit too tight. Though he'd never say it aloud, the memories of what happened at the USJ during their first year still lingered, buried deep, but far from forgotten. The chaos, the villains, the helplessness, it all swirled quietly beneath the surface of his usually composed demeanor. Izuku, ever the observant one especially when it came to Katsuki, tilted his head slightly in benign concern. "Katsuki, is something wrong?" he asked, his voice careful and considerate, like he already had a sense of what might be lurking beneath the surface. There was no pressure in his tone, just a steady, understanding warmth, as if he knew exactly which memories were trying to claw their way back into Katsuki's mind. Katsuki let out a quiet huff of breath, one he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His gaze met Izuku's, and for a moment, the stiffness in his expression eased just slightly. "I'm fine," he muttered, stubborn as ever, though. The faint tremor in his voice betrayed him. Izuku notices the little tremble in Katsuki's tone and begins to speak. "You know, people are easily seduced by nostalgia dash." He had just begun to speak when Katsuki cut him off. "What the hell are you on about?" he snapped, the edge in his voice sharp, but the faint tremble underneath was still noticeable, even if barely. Izuku wagged his finger. Let me finish, Katsuki." He continued, his voice calm and steady. "Like I said, nostalgia can be stuck. Whether the emotions it brings are good or bad, it has a way of pulling us back, making us linger in the past. Even if just for a little while. We remember the warmth, the friendships, the growth, but we tend to forget how much it hurt to get there." Katsuki raised a brow, clearly unimpressed. "What kind of shit are you spouting, Deku?" he muttered, resurrecting the old nickname for the sake of his annoyance. Izuku, undeterred, continued without missing a beat. "What I'm saying is I can tell, just by the way you're acting, that you're caught in nostalgia too." He paused, reaching out to rest a gentle hand on Katsuki's shoulder. "Whether you felt like this for a while, I don't know. But it's clear to me that some of the trauma we both picked up at the USJ is starting to resurface. This place, it meant a lot to us. Still does. But that doesn't mean it didn't leave scars too." Katsuki tensed beneath Izuku's hand, just for a second, then slowly relaxed, the weight of Izuku's words settling in. He let out a soft, almost reluctant chuckle, eyes flicking to the side as he muttered, "You and your dim and nerdy words." It wasn't quite an admission, but it was close enough. A comfortable silence settled between the two, the kind that didn't need to be filled. The gentle hum of the road beneath them continued until, a few quiet minutes later, the bus finally came to a stop with a soft hiss of the brakes. Izuku and Katsuki rose from their seats at the back of the bus, ushering the students out in an orderly line. Once everyone had gathered in front of the USJ, the two guided them inside into the vast, cavernous space where a variety of environments sprawled out before them, each one simulating a different type of disaster scenario. Izuku clapped his hands together sharply, cutting through the eager murmurs. Once the students quieted, he stepped forward to stand beside Katsuki at the front. "Class 1A, he began, a hint of pride in his voice. "It's an honor for me to welcome you to the USJ, the Unforeseen Simulation Joint. An explanation of the lesson will merge to the next chapter." Izuku's perspective, Katsuki's perspective. Izuku clapped his hands together sharply, cutting through the eager murmurs. Once the students quieted, he stepped forward to stand beside Katsuki at the front. Class 1A, he began, a hint of pride in his voice. It's an honor to welcome you to the USJ, the Unforeseen Simulation Joint. His eyes scanned the wide space around them before returning to his students. Today and for the next few days we'll be focusing on rescue heroics. You'll be divided into teams for this assignment. Each team will choose a zone to work in, either one that complements your quirks or directly challenges them. The goal is to push your limits and force real strategic thinking. He took a small step forward, his tone shifting to one of instruction. Once your team has chosen a zone, you'll use the rest of today to observe, take notes, and build a strategy. I'll go over the next steps after all teams are formed and zones are locked in. Izuku paused, eyes sweeping the group as he clasped his hands in front of him. Questions? When silence followed, Katsuki's sharp gaze cut through the classroom, scanning each student one by one with the precision of a blade. He studied them closely like a scientist examining a volatile experiment, eyes narrowing slightly with each assessment. After a moment, he cast a sidelong glance toward Izuku. His gaze raked over him, lingering not just on the man himself but on the quiet authority that now seemed to follow him in his role as a teacher. Katsuki watched as Izuku ravished his bag and with a whip of his wrist, swiftly brought a manila file into view. Izuku opened the file and then spoke, "I will now assign you all to groups. Listen accordingly for your name and remain vigilant so you can find your groups." Izuku clears his throat and announces the groups. Once the groups had formed, Izuku watched as the students dispersed to explore the vast expanse of the USA. He had granted them the entire class PRD to observe, plan, and strategize which zone would suit their quirks best, which terrain offered the greatest advantage. Those were the questions Izuku wanted lingering in each of their minds as they wandered. Izuku let out a quiet sigh and turned toward Katsuki, who stood with arms crossed, leaning against the towering doors of the USA. The faint hum of student chatter echoed in the distance as Izuku walked over, his footsteps light but deliberate. Without a word, he joined Katsuki at the wall shoulder to shoulder, both gazing out at the sprawling facility before them. The USJ stretched wide and endless, filled with possibilities, challenges, and memories. For a moment, the two stood in silence, watching the next generation scatter across the simulated disaster zones, each student eager to prove themselves, much like they once had. Katsuki's shoulders were mildly tense from being here again. Back when he was a teen, he shoved the trauma from the USJ incident so far down he nearly forgot it existed, burying it, seeing vulnerability as weakness. But things had changed. After the war, and only after a very vigorous yet strangely caring conversation with Izuku, Katsuki had finally allowed himself to feel, to acknowledge his emotions, to be vulnerable. Even so, he rarely showed it. Izuku cast a side glance at Katsuki and muttered under his breath, "Thinking about what I said?" Katsuki tilted his head slightly in Izuku's direction, a silent signal that he was listening, even if he refused to meet his eyes. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath his skin, and after a pause thick with unspoken weight, he finally mumbled, "Yeah." Izuku's head lulled to the side in quiet appreciation. "Yeah? I'm honored," he hummed, the last part spoken in a mildly teasing tone. Katsuki, instead of snapping back with a snarky comment like he usually would, let out a quiet huff. "You were right. That whole nostalgia thing," he muttered, shifting his gaze a little closer to Izuku, stubbornly refusing to meet his eyes just yet. A brief pause settled in the air between them, Izuku slightly taken aback by Katsuki's words. He hadn't talked to Katsuki about admitting things. No, this was something Katsuki had come to terms with on his own. A wave of second-hand pride and quiet triumph flowed through Izuku's entire being. Izuku composed himself, clearing his throat momentarily, and finally spoke. "Glad to hear it." Katsuki gave a slight nod. Despite the silence that often slipped between the two in nearly every interaction, the juxtaposition that existed in two was enough to entertain their minds a little. After all, while being absolute opposites, they always found each other again, and again, and again. Izuku let the tranquility linger for a minute, before graciously breaking it by muttering, "You know, I too have been reliving the memories. The other day, I explained the internships a little just to give the kids a head start, and just the thought gave me shivers. Hosu was terrible. I can't picture them being thrown into a situation like that so early on. I couldn't bear to see them follow the same path we stumbled into, you know?" Katsuki finally looks at Izuku. "Yeah, I remember. Shitty times. I mean, informing them early on about the internships would have been something I'd have liked to hear back in high school. You weren't supposed to tell anyone about your interaction with Stain or you'd be in trouble, right?" Katsuki's shoulders visibly loosening with Izuku's presence providing a kind of solace, someone to relate to. He was still slightly uncomfortable being back in the USJ, but even so, he wasn't gonna let that affect him. Izuku let out an almost humorless laugh. "Bingo. Didn't stop me from telling you, I guess." He looked into Katsuki's eyes for a second and smiled. "Heck, I even told you about being All Might's successor. Jesus. Thinking about it, high school me couldn't shut up to save my life when it came to you." His tone was lighthearted, despite the nerves they both felt from revisiting the USJ. Katsuki's expression visibly softens. "Honestly, you couldn't." "You still do," he teased, a lopsided grin tugging at his lips. Izuku returned the favor, offering a crooked smile and a laugh. "I don't," he defended weakly, his tone laced with mock annoyance, despite the hint of amusement that shone through. "I keep things from you nowadays," he huffed playfully in a matter-of-fact tone. Katsuki shifted his position against the wall, now leaning on his side as he listened more attentively. "Oh really? Care to give an example?" he asked, his tone dipping into something lower, more smug. Izuku muttered in a half-hearted tone, "Wouldn't exactly be keeping something from you if I told you now, would it?" He rolled his eyes though he seemed annoyed. It was all in good faith. Katsuki's perspective? Katsuki huffed. "Of course you'd say that." His tone, however, was more amused than anything. He momentarily shifted his gaze to their surroundings, taking it all in once more. Despite the tension that still clung to him and the unease stirred by the location, Katsuki felt at ease with Izuku by his side. Somehow, Izuku always managed to get through to him, whether it was convincing him to open up or simply being there. Izuku brought a strange sort of peace to Katsuki's mind. Not that he'd ever admit that out loud. He'd rather die again first. After a minute or so of silence, Katsuki tilted his head back toward Izuku, letting his eyes trace the contours of his face as Izuku quietly watched his students. Sure, Katsuki had already taken note of the changes Izuku had undergone over the last 10 months that morning, but now, looking at him, he wasn't scrutinizing him like he had been earlier. No, now he was almost admiring him. Seeing Izuku in this new role guiding the next generation just as Aizawa once had cast him in a different light. It shifted Katsuki's perspective, offering a view of Izuku that was new. And quietly, deeply respectful though foreign. A sense of tranquility overcame all thoughts Katsuki had, even the stubborn tension that clung to his shoulders dwindled from sense. Every grain of inner turmoil faded as Katsuki took a deep breath. Silence surrounded the two once more. He watches Izuku only for a moment more, before sparing his gaze for the expectant students who kept looking back at him and Izuku while they explored. A sense of tranquility washed over Katsuki, quieting every thought that had once buzzed through his mind. Even the stubborn tension clinging to his shoulders began to fade. Each grain of inner turmoil softened as he took a deep breath, letting the moment settle. Silence fell between the two again. Katsuki watched Izuku for a moment longer before shifting his gaze to the expectant students, some of whom kept glancing back at them as they explored. Izuku's perspective, amazed face. Izuku peaceably overlooked the students, the silence that enveloped them washing over him in calming waves. Though the sight was bittersweet, offering a tantalizing glimpse of the future that had snatched away from him, watching his students study their surroundings, carefully examining every detail, filled him with a deep sense of nostalgia. As he had said earlier, nostalgia is stuck, and now he was under its spell. Izuku, ever self-willed and headstrong, shook off the feeling with a firm resolve. "I'm not doing that again." He cursed himself internally for letting himself lapse into memory even if momentarily. The waves of remembrance, disrupted by Izuku's actions as he shrugged off the spell, refusing to let those thoughts and emotions get the better of him. For a brief second, he could practically feel Katsuki's gaze on him. He understood, at least partially, that Katsuki had a habit of carefully scrutinizing everything around him, misreading Katsuki's actions for observation and not admiration as it was. Blissfully unaware of many things, or perhaps simply prone to misperception, this was one of those scenarios. Izuku's eyes danced across the vast expanse of the USJ, keeping a watchful eye on his students as they explored and strategized with their teams. Sparing a glance at his watch, Izuku called out loudly so the students could hear, "All right. Class is done. Write down your strategies, or at least keep a sharp memory of them, because tomorrow we're getting straight to business once I go over the assignment." He paused to ensure everyone was listening before continuing. "Get lined up at the exit, everybody, as we await the bus ride back to campus." Simultaneous murmur of, "Yes, sir," echoed from the students as they lined up at the exit, all except one, Kota. The young teen approached Izuku and Katsuki, muttering with his head tilted, "Mr. Midoriya, why did we wear our hero costumes if we weren't gonna use them?" Izuku smiled and answered without hesitation. I made you guys wear them for two reasons. First, so you could figure out if any environments would affect your costume, like how fire might burn certain materials. And second, because to enter the USJ, you either need to hand in a student ID or wear your hero costume, which is already registered in the system. I figured I'd spare you all the trouble of setting up your IDs. Those take about a month to process." Izuku chirped, ever the speakeasy type when it came to his students. Kota nodded in understanding and joined the rest of the class at the exit. Izuku's perspective, Katsuki's perspective. With a slight sigh of relief, knowing nothing had happened at the USJ like the villain attack that once marred their own experience, Izuku and Katsuki joined the rest of the class at the exit, walking ahead of the students as they departed. The students followed closely, boarding the bus once more, though this time, murmurs filled the air as they continued strategizing. Once the jungle of students scrambling for seats subsided, Izuku and Katsuki returned to their previous spot, seated deep within the bus. Just as before, a tranquil silence enveloped the two. Katsuki noticed this how, despite being rather talkative that morning, Izuku had gone almost radio silent at every chance he got. The stark contrast in their interactions made Katsuki wonder if it was due to the fatigue that came with teaching a chaotic class. His mind wandered, trying to figure out why Izuku wasn't talking as much as usual. Though Katsuki was known for his abrasive and prickly demeanor, it only served as a defense mechanism. Deep down, he was a sensitive guy, not necessarily as sensitive as Izuku, but words hit Katsuki harder than most in many scenarios. Katsuki often got hurt by words more deeply than he could process, so these feelings were never fully processed, simply buried and suppressed, thus his aggressive resolve. It all stemmed from his long-standing neglect of his own mental and emotional state. Izuku's talks about things like that had helped open Katsuki's eyes more than once, but most of the time, it felt futile. Katsuki felt a tinge of anxiety bubble up inside him. He took a slow, steady breath, letting his lungs fill with the air he desperately needed to calm down. The clambering of students arguing over who knows what interrupted Katsuki's winding train of thought. It was a much-needed distraction, allowing his breath to strip away a layer of stress at a time. Izuku noticed the slight tension in Katsuki's shoulders, but, for the sake of Katsuki's pride and to avoid getting blown up, he stayed silent. As the students scrambled and argued, a slightly annoyed huff escaped Izuku's lips. "What now?" he groaned mentally. Gently, yet sternly, he cleared his throat and gave the class a pointed glare that silently said, "Can you not get along, yeah?" The class quickly fell quiet. Izuku shifted his attention back to Katsuki, now noticing the slower, more deliberate rhythm of his breathing. Relief washed over Izuku seeing Katsuki return to a more composed state. Though his actions were subtle, they spoke volumes. Izuku felt a wave of calm knowing that whatever had been bothering Katsuki had finally settled. He's been noticing Katsuki would get tense at UA, though he was glad to be able to see the campus again. There was no denying that the events that happened at UA were traumatic. Izuku too felt tension and anxiety when he first came to teach at UA, but it gradually lessened as he got more and more indulged in his job as a teacher. He'd been noticing it throughout how Katsuki's body tensed since they stepped foot on UA grounds. Though Katsuki was clearly glad to see the campus again, there was no denying that some part of him still carried the weight of what had happened there. The memories laced with trauma, loss, and the pressures of hero society lingered like shadows. Izuku understood that feeling all too well. He too had felt that familiar tightness in his chest, that creeping sense of anxiety, when he first returned to UA as a teacher. The classrooms, the corridors, they were haunted by memories. But over time, as he poured himself into his new role, those ghosts began to quiet. The more he invested in guiding the next generation, the more peace he found. Slowly, the tension loosened. And though Katsuki was far from that point, Izuku hoped with time, with patience, he'd get there too. 10K words W. In total. Sitting together on the bus brought back memories, some good, some not. Katsuki, having finally calmed down, felt almost lightheaded from the earlier bout of mild hyperventilation. His shoulders sagged, the quiet murmurs of the students faded into the background as his head went fuzzy, and his vision began to blur at the edges. During the war, Katsuki had taken a gaping hole to the chest courtesy of Shigaraki. The blow had pierced his heart. But that wasn't the only damage Shigaraki had done. That same hole had grazed one of Katsuki's lungs, leaving him with lasting breathing issues. Though the wound had been sewn tightly with the thin yet durable fibers of Edgeshot's body, his lungs never fully recovered, hence the lightheadedness that came with something as simple as a few quick breaths. Before Katsuki could even register it, his world tilted slightly sideways. His head hit a hard surface, and everything went dark as he lost all consciousness. I'm so tired. Next chapter coming up. For Katsuki's perspective. Katsuki was out cold, lying limp on whatever hard surface he had collapsed onto. His head spun from the lack of oxygen, his lungs scrambling to do their job. The wound he'd earned during the war was doing him absolutely no favors. He felt almost omnipresent. He was vaguely aware of where his body was, but beyond that, everything else was a blur. All of his senses except touch and, oddly enough, taste were completely out of sync as he lay unconscious. As Katsuki lay trapped inside the darkness of his unconscious mind, a quiet realization dawned on him. It was never Izuku who had been pulling away or going quiet, it was Katsuki. He was the one who had been withdrawing, isolating himself from Izuku. He was pushing Izuku away. It was repeating their experience in middle school. Albeit on a smaller scale, he was slowly falling back into old habits. The thought alone causing Katsuki's breathing to pick up, despite his unconscious state. But Katsuki had only done that for one reason. He hadn't pushed Izuku away in middle school out of hate, but love. Katsuki had hurt Izuku relentlessly, verbally breaking him down, layer by layer. But he knew why he did it. Katsuki had harbored a burning love for Izuku back in middle school so strong, it hurt. And he knew Izuku felt it too. Yet still he pushed him away. Why? A question that echoed in Izuku's shattered voice like a broken record over and over. Why? Hell, Izuku had loved Katsuki so much he'd neglected his own well-being just to prioritize Katsuki's. Once Izuku knew Katsuki loved him, the only thing keeping him grounded on this earth was Katsuki. And it was because of how deeply Izuku cared that Katsuki had to push him away. It was a harsh reminder of Izuku's tendency to place others above himself, to disregard his own well-being in favor of those he loves. Every shove, every punch, every dim drop of blood spilled, every voice gone raw from screaming, it was all a stab straight to Katsuki's heart. But he had to. Because if he let Izuku love him, he knew Izuku would give up everything. His dreams. His future. Everything he had ever cared about. All for Katsuki. Katsuki swore he'd never let that happen. So he shoved Izuku further and further away in the name of protecting him. In the hope that Izuku would eventually give up on him. That he'd find someone who actually deserved him. Because Katsuki knew he was broken. And he'd rather die all over again than let Izuku give up everything for someone like him. He knew that truth with every fiber of his being. A selfish part of him still begged to hold onto the embers of love he had left. begged him to let Izuku love him the way he loved Izuku. To let himself become Izuku's world. And Izuku's. Now, while Izuku's embers had officially been snuffed out by the constant reminder that Katsuki would never love him the same, Katsuki's were igniting once more. Izuku's perspective. Izuku was glancing out the window, periodically checking that the students weren't causing a ruckus, when he suddenly felt a weight on his shoulder. He turned and was promptly met with the sight of a passed-out Katsuki leaning against him. Izuku was confused. Katsuki wouldn't just pass out like that. Concern growing, he checked Katsuki's breathing, watching the slightly rapid and shallow rise and fall of his chest. It looked labored and panicked, though quiet. Katsuki's body had gone into panic mode, trying to compensate for the earlier lack of oxygen, ironically making things worse after he'd already hit his limit. Izuku wrapped his arm cautiously around Katsuki's tense figure. Ever the gentle, supportive friend, Izuku gently held Katsuki's troubled body, observing his breathing. "Suki?" he whispered, barely audible over the hum of the bus engine. Panic bloomed quietly in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm for both their sakes. Gently, he pressed the back of his hand to Katsuki's forehead. No fever. No visible injuries. But still, Katsuki's breathing stayed short and uneven, his body trembling ever so slightly. Izuku swiftly tugged his phone out of his pocket and texted Recovery Girl, a marvel at UA for still being alive despite looking to be in her 80s by now, yet still providing her healing wonders. Possible respiratory distress. Katsuki Bakugo fell unconscious on the bus back from USJ. Breathing is rapid and shallow. No signs of trauma. I think it's the lung injury he got in the war doing this. What should I do? His fingers hovered over the send button, hesitating. Katsuki would hate this. Being seen like this. Vulnerable. But Izuku didn't care. Not right now. With his free hand, he gripped Katsuki's wrist, gently feeling his pulse beneath his fingertips. Fast but steady. Still present. A wave of relief flowed wildly throughout Izuku. "You're okay," Izuku murmured under his breath, coated generously with a sigh. Not sure if he was saying it for Katsuki. Or for himself. Across the aisle, a couple students looked over curiously, whispering to each other, but Izuku silenced them with a single look. His eyes spoke volumes and his gaze sharp. Not now. The bus rumbled beneath them, a low hum carrying them back toward UA, toward safety. Izuku shifted slightly, adjusting so Katsuki could lean against him more comfortably. He kept his hand over Katsuki's, thumb brushing over his knuckles in slow, absent-minded strokes, as if trying to comfort Katsuki, who most likely didn't even feel it whatsoever. Izuku sat silently as he waited for a response from Recovery Girl, who oddly enough was radio silent for a little while. He murmured more to himself than to Katsuki, "You're all right, just hang on." And silently, he prayed Katsuki could hear him. Recovery Girl's perspective. Recovery Girl was busy tending to the injuries of several clumsy or perhaps overly hardworking students from various courses when she felt the faint buzz of her phone. She noticed it briefly, but couldn't afford to stop. There were kids to heal, and her hands were full. With a small sigh, she chose to ignore the notification for now, silently hoping it wasn't anything urgent. It was only when the second notification buzzed on her phone that Recovery Girl realized something was wrong. Pausing mid-treatment, she had been healing some minor scrapes and bruises from a pair of overzealous Hero Corps students. She quickly wiped her hands and reached for the device. With a furrowed brow, she unlocked the screen and opened her messages. Her breath hitched. Midoriya. Possible respiratory distress. Katsuki Bakugo. Fell unconscious on the bus back from USJ. We're about mile 12 away from UA. Breathing is rapid and shallow. No signs of trauma. I think it's the lung injury he got during the war. What now? She barely finished reading before her eyes flicked to the second text, eager to see if Katsuki was okay. The next text was timestamped just 3 minutes later. Midoriya. I'm not sure what to do, Recovery Girl. His breathing is getting more frenzied. I need your help. Her stomach twisted. Izuku's words were laced with rising panic. Even his usual habit of adding emoticons couldn't mask the anxiety behind them. Her fingers flew over the keyboard despite the DMN arthritis that made her motions less fluid. Recovery girl. Lay him flat, but turn his head slightly to the side, no abrupt movements. Place him in this tripod position, semi-reclined. If his breathing worsens, monitor his breathing closely. Loosen anything around his neck or chest to help him breathe. Remove his neck piece or unzip the top of his hero costume if needed. Check for cyanosis. Make sure his lips and fingertips aren't turning a bluish hue. If his breathing stops or slows, prepare to perform CPR. I'll be there in 3 minutes. Recovery girl's perspective. Aizawa's perspective. With that, she rushed out of the infirmary, sparing only a second to call back to the students awaiting her aid. It's an emergency. Without wasting another moment, she pulled out her phone and dialed Aizawa, now the principal, asking him for a ride. Aizawa answered promptly. If recovery girl was calling, it had to be urgent. He listened carefully to her instructions and explanation of the situation and rushed to meet her at the front of the campus. Without wasting time, he ushered her into the car and quickly circled around to hop into the driver's seat. He drove quickly toward the USJ, urgency in every movement. His foot stayed heavy on the gas pedal, speeding them along the route. They were still 2 minutes away. Izuku's perspective. Katsuki's perspective. Meanwhile, Izuku had followed recovery girl's instructions, sliding out of his seat to let Katsuki lie flat across both bus seats. He pushed up the armrests and carefully adjusted Katsuki's position. Then, calling out to the bus driver from the back, his voice was drowned out by the chaos of clambering students, all trying to get a glimpse of the number one hero in such a vulnerable state. Out of sheer desperation to keep Katsuki stable, Izuku did something he rarely did. He shouted. Loudly. Firmly. Silence. The class, not used to seeing this side of Izuku, fell completely mute. They all knew his bond with Katsuki had to be strong for him to react like that. Izuku, with the newly made quiet, yelled to the bus driver, "Stop the bus. It's an emergency." Once the bus came to a slightly abrupt stop, Izuku quickly motioned to the aisle, urging the students to return to their seats. He needed to move Katsuki to the aisle, a flatter, more stable surface. With the new space cleared, Izuku, slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, held Katsuki in his arms and cautiously laid him down on the aisle floor. He then proceeded to follow recovery girl's thorough, step-by-step instructions. Gently, he lifted Katsuki's head and removed his neck piece as well as his headpiece. Next, he lifted Katsuki's torso just enough to unzip the hero costume from behind, quietly peeling down the upper half of the bodysuit, slipping Katsuki's arms out of the sleeves, and steadily removing the garment to expose Katsuki's upper body, letting it rest on his hips. The class gasped softly as they took in the scars adorning Katsuki's arms and chest. Their eyes settled on a medium-sized X scar etched across his chest, a stark reminder of Edgeshot's sacrifice to save his life. Despite the quiet gasps, the students remained otherwise silent, sensing that something was seriously wrong with the number one hero if he appeared like this. They all noticed the quick, shallow breaths Katsuki was taking. Izuku glanced anxiously at his phone, hoping for any sign that recovery girl was on her way. When no new messages or calls appeared, he set the device down with a sigh. Turning his attention back to Katsuki, Izuku carefully examined his fingers and lips, just as recovery girl had instructed. A faint bluish-purple tint stained the tips of Katsuki's fingers, a clear sign of cyanosis. Though Katsuki was breathing, the shallow, labored gasps told Izuku he was struggling desperately for air. Izuku's breath caught in his throat. If recovery girl didn't arrive soon, he would have to perform CPR. Katsuki could feel his lungs overworking to draw in much-needed oxygen. The rapid breaths stirred the now-healed wound in his lung, provoking pain and adding strain to his already troubled lungs. He knew he was in serious danger, barely clinging to a fragile awareness as his senses began to fade even more so than previously. The feeling was abstract, elusive. With every ragged breath, his wounded lungs whispered pain caught between the sharp edge of awareness and the fading veil of oblivion. Recovery girl's perspective. Aizawa's perspective. // Aizawa's foot stayed firm on the gas pedal, driven by both urgency and concern for his former student. He had witnessed Katsuki's injury during the war firsthand, but the fact that the wound was resurfacing years later was deeply troubling. That almost fatherly instinct had long taken root in him, and now, it felt less like a duty and more like a quiet obligation to protect Katsuki. Recovery Girl texted Izuku, her fingers slower now, arthritis flaring after her earlier burst of speed typing. She carefully tapped out the message. Recovery Girl. On my way with Aizawa. We're about 1 minute away. Hold tight, Midoriya. Her finger hovered over the send button for a brief moment before pressing down. She set the phone in her lap with a quiet sigh, worry etched across her face. Silently, she prayed that Katsuki was holding on. Izuku's perspective, Katsuki's perspective, ring operator, degree. Katsuki was on the brink of letting go, teetering at the edge of consciousness, ready to slip into the void. He struggled against the sabotage of his own body, the wound waging war on every breath that was already fractured and uneven. Even his sense of touch was beginning to fade. And yet, he was acutely aware of the top half of his hero costume being peeled away. With the weight of it gone, his chest felt lighter, giving his lungs just a bit more space to greedily steal air. But his breathing remained shaky, shallow. And it was only worsening. Izuku, observing Katsuki's breathing, could tell the situation was growing more dire. The tips of Katsuki's fingers were growing more of that bluish hue. The only reason Izuku hadn't done anything drastic yet was because he was holding out hope that Recovery Girl, with her far better judgment, would arrive in time. With the lack of a response from Recovery Girl, Izuku put his hands together about to perform CPR on Katsuki. Just then, Izuku's phone buzzed with a notification. His head snapped toward it so fast he might have pulled a muscle if not for the shred of restraint he still clung to. Grabbing the device with urgency, he tapped the screen and opened the message. Recovery Girl. On my way with Aizawa. We're about 1 minute away. Hold tight, Midoriya. A shaky breath of relief escaped Izuku's lips. Thank God, he thought, setting the phone aside and refocusing on monitoring Katsuki, heart still pounding. The class was shaken. Something had to be terribly wrong for the #1 hero to be in such a state, with Izuku hovering over him like a worried mother hen. Relief washed over Izuku the moment he heard Aizawa and Recovery Girl rush into the bus. Without wasting a second, he quickly explained the situation. I'm not sure what triggered it, but Katsuki zoned out like he was lost in thought, and then his breathing sped up. It aggravated the scar in his lung. He's still struggling to breathe, and as you can see, he's cyanotic. Izuku, Katsuki, Recovery Girl, and Aizawa's perspectives. Aizawa's fatherly instincts flared the moment he saw the bluish tinge on Katsuki's fingertips as Izuku explained the situation. He had always loved his former students like his own children, but seeing Katsuki lying flat on the ground, clearly struggling to breathe, sent a chill down his spine. It was all too familiar, eerily similar to the moment he'd once witnessed Katsuki's limp body collapse. That same flicker of disquiet passed through him, quick and jarring, like the blink of an eye. To see the shell of an explosive, vibrant teen simply fall after giving everything it had been a sight that made time itself feel cruel. And now, seeing Katsuki in a frighteningly similar state, Aizawa's heart lurched. The mild PTSD from that day flared hot in his chest, ignited by the terrifying possibility that history might repeat itself. Recovery Girl, having not witnessed Katsuki's momentary death, didn't feel the same intensity as the others. She saw him now not as the grown man Japan revered as the #1 hero, but as the explosive, stubborn teen she had once tended to, whether he wanted her care or not. In her eyes, he was still the feisty teen who always resisted her help, reluctant to let anyone patch him up. But always when they were alone he'd offer a quiet thank you. Even if it was short and gruff, it spoke volumes. Behind the sharp tone was a hesitant but genuine appreciation that she'd come to understand well. She listened intently as Izuku explained the situation, nodding with calm precision. With practiced hands, she gently lifted Katsuki into the tripod position, propping him up just enough to keep his airway open and ease the strain on his lungs. She reclined him slightly, careful not to push too far, allowing his chest more space to rise and fall. Every movement was deliberate, aimed at helping his body fight for the air it so desperately needed. A pang of dread twisted in Izuku's chest. He knew logically that Katsuki would be okay. Recovery Girl was here. Aizawa was here. But seeing Katsuki in pain, gasping for breath, always unearthed the same horrific memory, Katsuki's lifeless body, left behind like a cruel trophy by Shigaraki. It was a haunting image, one that had carved itself into Izuku's soul. For someone usually so full of hope, it was a dark, unspoken scar. He hated himself for it, but a small, bitter part of him had begun to adapt to the idea of losing Katsuki. That part whispered cruel things, told him to brace himself, to prepare for the possibility that Katsuki might not wake up. But the rest of him, his hands, his heart, his soul violently rejected it. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to fight the thought, to believe with everything he had that Katsuki would open his eyes. Because Katsuki will wake up. Katsuki felt his grip on reality slipping. That all-too-familiar veil of false serenity, the dark, lonesome peace that existed only inside his skull, beckoned him to let go. To let this shaky breath be his last. The situation was dire, and he could feel it in his bones. His body was beginning to shut down, the old wound in his lung tearing open again, raw and unforgiving. It was terrifying how something so simple, so small, could tip him over the edge. Just a minor anxiety attack. That's all it was. But when Izuku was involved, nothing was ever minor. Even the flick of a mental switch became a landslide if it was in relation to Izuku. Just the thought of pushing Izuku away again, of slipping back into those cruel old habits, all in the name of protecting him, was enough to damn near give Katsuki a heart attack. But he knew it would happen if he wasn't cautious, if he allowed his fear take the wheel again. That instinct to shove Izuku away, to build walls instead of bridges, was still buried deep in him like a reflex he hadn't fully forgotten but learned to hate. One misstep, one flicker of panic or self-doubt, and he could fall right back into being the person who hurt Izuku in the name of keeping him safe. And Katsuki didn't know if he or Izuku could survive that again. I put a lot more emoticons to ease the situation. I don't know, I also felt a little silly. I'm going to Spain, so I'll be on a 2-week hiatus. I'll try to write in a notebook or something. Extra exactly 13,600 words, in total. Izuku, Katsuki, Recovery Girl, and Aizawa's perspectives, winky face. Relapsing into his old ways. Slipping back into that twisted, defensive mindset. Katsuki wouldn't allow it. He refused to let Izuku bleed for the sake of his own stubborn, guarded heart. His heart. The same heart that still ached, still lurched at the memory of what he'd seen far too often years ago, forest green stained crimson, a soft voice worn ragged from pain. And as Katsuki felt himself teetering on the edge again, he knew, with painful clarity, he didn't deserve Izuku. Not then. Not now. Maybe not ever. Old habits truly die hard. The current Class 1A, usually a balanced mix of optimism and realism, found themselves caught in a strange, heavy silence. No one dared to think, let alone believe, that this would be what took down the #1 hero, whatever this was. But try as they might, none of them could summon a single hopeful thought either. The sight of Katsuki Bakugo, the unshakable, explosive force they'd all looked up to, now pale and struggling to breathe, shook something in each of them. They stood still, suspended somewhere between denial and dread, waiting for someone else to say what none of them could. That same denial, the one quietly stitched into Recovery Girl's every action, echoed through the room. Katsuki will be fine. But it was more than just her own willful hope. It was the collective dread. The unspoken desperation stockpiled in every breath from those present, especially Izuku, that fueled her determination to help him. Without even realizing it, she had grabbed the portable oxygen kit on her way out of the infirmary. Instinct, it seemed, had moved faster than thought. Thank God for that. Before anything else, Recovery Girl gently tilted Katsuki's head back, lifting his chin with 2 fingers. His breathing was shallow, almost silent. "Let me see," she murmured, leaning closer. She peered into his mouth. No vomit, no blood, no obstruction. His airway seemed clear, but the harsh rasp in his throat made her frown. Airways open, but he's struggling. Oxygen now, she said, reaching for the mask. Bakugo, if you can hear me, breathe slowly. You're safe. Just breathe. Aizawa grabbed the oxygen mask already prepped and flowing. With steady hands, he gently placed it over Katsuki's nose and mouth, the soft hiss of 10 to 15 liters of oxygen per minute filling the space between them. Beside him, Recovery Girl leaned in, checking the reservoir bag to ensure it was inflating properly, her focus sharp and unwavering. As the reservoir bag inflated, Recovery Girl shifted her focus to check for signs of consciousness. Katsuki's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and erratic, uncannily similar to how he had looked during the war, just before his heart gave out from that devastating wound. She turned to Izuku, her voice firm but not unkind. Say something to him, something he'll respond to. Katsuki listens to you more than anyone, Midoriya. Izuku swallowed, nodding once before leaning in close. His voice was calm, steady, anchored in hope. Katsuki? Are you there? Please. If you can hear me, do something. Anything. His tone wasn't demanding, it was gentle, coaxing, as if guiding Katsuki back from the edge with nothing but his voice. Katsuki heard Izuku's voice like an echo reverberating through a cave, distant, but familiar. He beckoned his eyes to open, even just a sliver, to see him. But they refused, heavy and uncooperative. His body wouldn't move, limbs weighed down and unresponsive. So instead, he forced out a breath and barely mumbled, "Izuku." It was faint, shaky, his rapid breathing splintering the word, but it was enough. A sign. A lifeline. Katsuki was still there, semi-conscious and clinging to Izuku's voice like it was the only thing keeping him from slipping further. Recovery Girl watched Katsuki's breathing with a keen eye. Even with the oxygen mask, it remained somewhat labored. His airways were clear, however. It was then the reality settled in. Izuku had been right. His earlier guess was correct. The cause wasn't a new injury, but the old wound Katsuki had sustained during the war. Perhaps the stitch in his lung had torn under the strain of his frantic, uneven breaths, his lungs greedy for the air they so desperately craved. Surgery was undoubtedly necessary. They couldn't afford to remain stationary on the bus, not when Katsuki's condition was worsening by the second. They had to get to UA and fast. He needed to be in the infirmary before his lungs collapsed. Katsuki was already cyanotic, and that alone was dangerous. But now, with the confirmation that the old wound was the cause, the situation had become even more critical. Dun. Degree. The bus jolted onward the moment Recovery Girl gave the go-ahead. The driver didn't need further instruction. One glance at Katsuki's pale skin, now tinged a bluish hue, was enough to understand. Izuku sat beside him, one hand braced on Katsuki's shoulder as the other gently cradled his wrist, thumb pressed to the near center of the strong flesh, feeling for the rhythm of his pulse. "Katsuki," he whispered, voice low and trembling. "Just hang on. We're almost there." Katsuki's chest rose and fell in shallow stutters. Each breath strained a sound that sent Izuku's worry into a frenzy only Katsuki's pain enticed, haunted by the uncanny resemblance to his past death. The oxygen mask hissed steadily, not nearly enough to stop him from slipping away, only to keep him tethered to consciousness until they reached UA grounds. Recovery Girl checked his vitals again, her mouth set in a tight line. "He's losing oxygen too fast. If that lung collapses en route." She refused to continue such a sentence. The necessity to address the situation dying on her tongue. Izuku swallowed hard, his eyes aching with the flood of wet, emotional waters, his usually bright, forest green gaze sinking into a glazed, pain-stricken stare. "You're not dying on me," he whispered, more to himself than to Katsuki. "Not now. Not like this. You promised you'd never let it happen again." A faint noise caught in Katsuki's throat, not a word, but a fragile echo of awareness. Like a voice lost in the facade of serenity. His fingers twitched, barely brushing against Izuku's hand, an instinctive reach, subtle but unmistakable. "Come on, Katsuki." Izuku breathed, his voice cracking. "Don't you dare quit now. Where's that fight I know you've got?" Outside the bus, the landscape blurred, Yui drawing closer by the second. time feeling awfully cruel as if taking its sweet time. The pain Katsuki had hidden was catching up to him now, the injury he'd earned as a FING teenager thrown into war. One he never fully recovered from, the one he'd always brushed off with a scoff and a curse, as if it didn't eat him alive every time he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. But now, it threatened, with a sadistic smile, to take everything Katsuki had fought to regain, everything he'd built. His career, the fruition of his dreams, the thoughts that once ran through his mind, so previously dead and empty. All of it snatched away from Katsuki's firm grip. From the hands that should be cold and limp, but instead were warm, fluid, and most importantly alive. All thanks to the hero who'd held a place in Katsuki's heart since figuratively and literally edge-shot. The silence in the bus was broken only by the hum of the engine and the rasp of Katsuki's breaths. Every second mattered. Every breath counted. Every moment Katsuki felt like he was being. The pain clawed through his chest as if it bared fangs. Breathing wasn't simply harsh, it was cruel, punishing. But through the haze, he felt it, Izuku's hand, still wrapped around his wrist. Steady. Unshakable. Izuku's soft fingers remained looped around Katsuki's wrist in a forbearing grip, watchfully monitoring Katsuki's pulse. He wasn't letting go. Not now. Not ever. The bus jerked to a halt, the tires screeching subtly at the prompt arrival. The UA gates loomed ahead, wide open, staff awaiting their presence at the entrance as they've been alerted the moment Recovery Girl ran off. The students were ushered back to the locker rooms to change into their uniforms once more for their next class. Even while doing so, the students remained tense and worried, the dread of what they witnessed tugging at their shoulders. With the students out of the picture, Recovery Girl moved quickly, barking orders with quiet authority, firm and urgent. Midoriya, stay close but don't get in the way. Izuku barely heard her, his eyes were locked on Katsuki, watching the rise and fall of his chest like it was the only thing that kept the world from spinning. The doors greeted the group of medics, Izuku's mind a blur as Katsuki was lifted onto a gurney. The shift jostled him, hard enough for him to will sharp sound from his throat, half pain, half protest. Katsuki, having not been able to speak much previously, but now, with the sudden absence of Izuku's touch, a sharp sense of urgency surged through him. As he felt Izuku's warm, calloused hands slip away, just out of his reach from his own while being transferred onto the gurney, his heart refused to stay silent. His mind, his soul, every fiber in his being rejected the thought of remaining still. And somehow, in his fragile state, he managed a miracle. Still. Here. Katsuki rasped, his voice barely audible beneath the steady hiss of oxygen, but the tone was unmistakable. Stubborn, set off. But especially, alive. Izuku blinked fast, forcing back the sting in his eyes. Willing the tsunami of emotions swirling inside him to subside for the sake of Katsuki's insubstantial state. I know, he said, running alongside the gurney. Just hold on to that fight a little longer. Katsuki lacked response this time. Eyelids heavy, lips a sick bluish hue, jaw clenched like he was fighting the eternal sleep with everything left in him. The absence of the one thing anchoring him, Izuku's hand, hit harder than anything else. So he willed his body to move. Despite the weight pressing down on every limb, Katsuki could do the impossible if Izuku was involved. So he proceeded to break the rules that defined his state. Gritting through the exhaustion, he commanded his trembling hand to reach out. Slowly, shakily, it inched toward Izuku's palm, up, fingers curled just slightly, resting there in silent expectancy. Waiting for Izuku's warmth to find him again. Izuku's eyes softened as he saw Katsuki's trembling hand reach out. He didn't see his childhood bully in that moment, but his childhood best friend. Without hesitation, he gently clasped his hand over Katsuki's, warm and steady, a calm anchor amid the chaos surrounding them. He whispered, almost more to himself than to Katsuki, "I'm here. Just keep fighting, Katsuki." His fingers tightened just a little, offering silent strength. No words could say what this simple touch meant. They both knew it was everything. Inside the infirmary, the light was sterile and bright, too clean for the chaos that was about to spill in. Machines like a fresh oxygen mask and heart monitor were prepped and waiting. Recovery Girl sat beside Katsuki's gurney, her healing quirk ready for use. Instead of stitching a wound that would inevitably tear again, she was prepared to accelerate the healing, compressing up to 3 to 6 weeks of recovery into mere hours. Izuku froze at the threshold, disabled to move past where he stood. His breath caught in his throat at the sight of Katsuki surrounded by all the medical equipment once more. Recovery Girl turned to him, her expression tight and professional. But behind her eyes, worry and urgency flickered an unspoken weight that rarely left her face. This is going to take everything I've got. Izuku nodded firmly, fists clenched at his sides. Then give it everything. Because Katsuki had always fought harder than anyone. Now it was their turn. Time skip, about 1 hour later. The sterile hum of machines filled the room, steady and unrelenting. Recovery Girl's hands moved with precision, her quirk weaving through Katsuki's torn tissue, stitching together what had been broken not with thread, but with accelerated healing. Izuku sat nearby, eyes refusing to leave Katsuki's pale face. The blue tint around his lips had faded slightly, replaced by a faint flush of returning life. His breathing, though still fragile, had found a steadier rhythm beneath the oxygen mask. Minutes felt like hours as they awaited a sign, each and every one of them suspended between hope and fear. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Katsuki's fingers twitched inside Izuku's grasp. A breath caught in Izuku's chest. Recovery Girl glanced up, a tired but relieved smile tugging at her lips. He's pulling through. Izuku squeezed Katsuki's hand tighter, whispering, "You're stronger than anyone I know. Keep fighting, Katsuki." The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time since the crisis began, the tide seemed to be turning. Yet another time skip, 2+ hours later. The once harsh beep of the heart monitor had steadied into a calm rhythm, a quiet victory amid the sterile walls of the infirmary. Katsuki's chest rose and fell with more strength now, his color steadily improving under the watchful eyes of Recovery Girl and Izuku. Though unconscious, his body was healing faster than anyone expected, all thanks to Recovery Girl. The deep wounds in his lungs sealed beneath Recovery Girl's quirk, and the stubborn cyanosis that once tinged his skin was retreating. Izuku sat close like a moth to a flame. He remained at Katsuki's gurney, fingers still entwined with Katsuki's, unwilling to let go. The tension in his shoulders had eased only partially, replaced by a fragile hope, one that trembled like a held breath, daring to believe they might finally be past the worst. Recovery Girl stood nearby, her small frame weighed down by the toll of hours spent healing Katsuki's lung. The lines that creased her face were deeper now, etched by time, worry, and the strain of pouring everything she had into one stubborn, broken man. Still, she remained steady, eyes sharp and trained on the monitors even as exhaustion tugged at her limbs. "He's stable for now," she murmured softly, her voice nearly lost in the quiet hum of machines. "But he's not out of danger yet. His vitals are still fragile. We need to keep monitoring him closely." Izuku nodded, but his eyes never left Katsuki. "Whatever it takes. I'll be here," he whispered, and he meant it every word. He'd remain at Katsuki's side for as long as it took. Even if Katsuki wouldn't wake up for a couple hours or so, even if he had to relive the grim memory of that lifeless body all over again, he would endure it. Because Katsuki had. Because Katsuki always did. Izuku's grip on Katsuki's hand tightened just slightly, not to wake him, but to remind him. "I'm not going anywhere. Not this time." Recovery Girl glanced at him, a flicker of something soft in her tired eyes. "You always were stubborn, Midoriya," she said gently. "But that's what makes you and Katsuki so similar." Izuku didn't smile, nor did he look away. He simply nodded, once firm, steady, and silent. The worry that had once latched to Izuku's every thought like a vice had begun to loosen its rein. Not gone entirely, but eased. Now, that sharp, relentless fear was slowly being replaced by a quieter mantra. Katsuki just has to stay stable. That was all. Just breathe. Just hold on. Easy enough, he told himself. The words felt thin, fragile, like they could crack if he thought too hard about them. Since Katsuki had passed out, nothing had been easy. Not the image of Katsuki collapsing onto him. Not the silence between heartbeats when it seemed like he might never speak again. And certainly not the helpless hours spent beside his unmoving body. Still, Izuku clung to that simple truth. Katsuki was stable. That was enough for now. He let out a slow breath, as if trying to exhale the weight of everything that had led them here. If stability was the solitary thing standing between Katsuki and recovery, then Izuku would believe in it with everything he had. It's 3 a.m. for me. After another several hours with a lack of response, Katsuki's eyes slit open. With little memory of what had occurred after the healing started, he felt greatly fatigued. His chest especially sore, his throat healed after drawn raw from his erratic breathing. His fingertips and lips had their original hue, unlike the unhealthy bluish hue they took on as Katsuki's state worsened. Recovery girl's quirk will often, depending on the wounds and their severity, leave herself and her patients overwhelmingly tired. This is all due to how healing takes tons of energy, and for weeks of healing to be compressed into 3-1-2 hours, took a great toll on Katsuki and herself. Both will need some beauty rest. Me too. Katsuki's eyes fluttered open, the barest sliver of light slipping past his heavy eyelids. The sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic assaulted his nose, and the harsh overhead lights stabbed at his vision, making the world feel too bright, too sharp. A low groan escaped his throat, not loud, not angry, just tired. Everything hurt, but for once, he didn't complain. He didn't need to. He was awake. And more importantly, he was alive. The numbness of death, its cold, brooding, and almost enticing pull was an entium feeling. Katsuki had felt it once before, and he'd never forgotten the quiet, terrifying peace it offered. He remembered how convincing its promise of eternal tranquility had been, how, in that moment, it seemed easier, softer, greener than the pain-stricken life he'd always known. Waking up now, no matter how harsh the lights or sterile the air, felt like a gift he refused to take for granted. Izuku, settled peaceably at his side, caught the discomfort in Katsuki's groan instantly. Without hesitation, he raised a hand and gently shielded Katsuki's eyes, not directly obscuring his view, just enough to dull the blinding sting of the infirmary lights above. Katsuki blinked slowly, adjusting. Then, with a voice roughened by exhaustion yet softer than usual, he muttered, "Thanks." The word was gruff, instinctive, but something in his tone had changed, less sharp, less guarded. Perhaps it was the sick fatigue that still clung to him, or maybe it was the relief. Or something else entirely. Izuku offered a small smile, his hands still lingering protectively in the air. Still serving as a shield from the world Katsuki would have to come to terms with soon, but for now, he let Katsuki remain oblivious. "Welcome back." His voice echoed through the otherwise silent room. For the sake of Katsuki's recovery, he kept his emotions tightly restrained. He couldn't bring himself to tell Katsuki what was unfolding just beyond the supposedly secure walls of the infirmary. Just beyond the so-called secure doors, the people of Japan were already asking questions, wondering what had happened to their number one pro-hero. The students, overwhelmed by anxiety and uncertainty, had turned to their peers in the hero course at UA, needing someone to vent to. And with both the current and former number one heroes involved, it didn't take long for the news to explode. Within the few short hours Katsuki had been unconscious and recovering, word had spread like wildfire. The entire country knew. However, the truth of what happened remained a blur to nearly everyone except for Recovery Girl, Aizawa, and Izuku, who had been there through every fragile breath, every second Katsuki teetered on the edge. They were the only ones who knew just how close things had come to disaster. And with no official statement released, the vacuum of silence filled quickly with speculation. Rumors began to swirl across Japan like storm clouds. Journalists pounced on every scrap of information, sensationalizing what little they had. Within hours, headlines lit up every screen and paper. Number one pro-hero, Ground Zero, found unconscious at UA. Reason, unknown. Ground Zero collapses at the USJ. Cyanosis in Japan's top hero? Ground Zero's health in question. Each headline was louder and more frantic than the last, feeding the public's panic. The nation's symbol of strength had faltered and no one outside that infirmary knew why. Izuku's phone buzzed nonstop, frantic with messages from their friends, each one filled with panic and confusion, screenshots of headlines flooding his screen. What happened? Is it true? Please tell me he's okay. The words varied, but the desperation was the same. Still, Izuku didn't flinch. He didn't respond. He silenced the phone, switching it to Do Not Disturb, and set it face down on the counter beside Katsuki's bed. Whatever the world assumed, whatever chaos was erupting outside, none of it mattered right now. All that mattered was him. Izuku stayed at Katsuki's side, fingers curled gently around his hand, gaze unwavering. He was going to be there, no matter what. Izuku and Katsuki's perspective. Understood. Darkness wasn't always empty. Sometimes it pulsed quiet and heavy, like a heartbeat underwater. Katsuki floated there, somewhere between memory and pain, between past and present. He wasn't sure if he was dreaming, dying, or just too tired to care. When his eyelids finally fluttered open, sterile white light cut into his vision like a blade. Or maybe it was the lack of focus, everything too bright, too unreal. Then came a shadow. A hand, gently shielding his eyes from the glare. His brows knit together, and he muttered hoarsely, "Thanks." And then he heard it. So familiar. A voice just barely shaking, but rooted deep in his bones. "Welcome back, Izuku." Katsuki remembered the panic. The way his lungs clawed for air. The helplessness that had taken hold of him, quiet and cruel. The silence that crawled in from the edges of his mind like fog. He'd almost let go again. Hell, he wanted to, because for one terrifying moment, it felt easier than failing in front of him. Failing in front of Izuku again. But that DMN nerd. He stayed. He always stayed. And Katsuki, no matter how much he hated his own weakness, no matter how much he despised being seen like this, he couldn't ignore the quiet relief blooming in his chest. He was alive. Izuku had been there. And somehow, that made it bearable. His hand wasn't empty. Izuku was still holding it. Katsuki swallowed against the roughness in his throat. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" he rasped. Izuku startled slightly, then gave a soft, breathy laugh. "Neither do you." Izuku's laugh faded into the quiet hum of the machines. Katsuki could hear the steady beep of the heart monitor and the soft hiss of oxygen. The stillness in the room felt heavy, too quiet for what had just happened. He closed his eyes again, not because he was tired, though his body screamed for rest, but because the lights were still too dim and bright, cutting through him like a knife. It was easier to hide in the darkness behind his eyelids. Every breath dragged, sharp and aching, as if his lungs were raw and fragile. He felt hollow, as if parts of him had been left behind in the space between life and death. How bad was it? His voice was barely a whisper, rough and raw. Izuku hesitated, the weight of the truth heavy on his shoulders. "Your breathing sped up and reopened that scar you got on your lung during the war. You went cyanotic, your body was shutting down. If Recovery Girl hadn't gotten here when she did." He didn't finish. Katsuki's jaw clenched tightly. Of course it had been that close. Of course his body had betrayed him right in front of the one person he never wanted to see him broken. Slowly, he exhaled, the tension in his jaw easing just a little. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said, voice low and thick with something unspoken. Izuku blinked, concern flickering across his face. "See what?" "Me. Like that." There was no edge to his words, only quiet frustration and a flicker of shame Katsuki would never admit out loud. Izuku's expression softened, and he leaned in just a little, as if trying to close the space between them. "Katsuki, it doesn't matter how I see you. You're still here. You're still fighting. That's all that matters." Katsuki didn't respond. Instead, he shifted his hands slowly, hesitating just a moment before letting it rest in Izuku's, feeling the warmth settle deep inside his chest. "You never leave," he murmured, voice barely audible. "I won't," Izuku replied without hesitation, his gaze steady and sure. Katsuki didn't argue, didn't push away. He didn't say thank you either, not yet. But he held on, worn down, raw, and so dim and tired, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself lean on someone. Just for now. The room remained still, save for the steady beeping of the monitor and the quiet rhythm of their breaths. Katsuki's fingers twitched lightly within Izuku's grasp, a small but significant gesture, a silent truce in the battle he'd fought alone for so long. "Don't think this means I'm soft," Katsuki muttered, voice rough but laced with something almost like a smirk. Izuku chuckled softly, the sound a bomb in the sterile room. "Wouldn't dream of it." For a moment, neither spoke. The weight of everything past and present pressed down, but in this fragile bubble, it was just them. No expectations, no masks, just two people clinging to the fragile thread of hope. Katsuki's eyes fluttered closed again, exhaustion pulling at him, but the warmth of Izuku's hand was a steady anchor. "Stay with me a little longer," Katsuki murmured, barely audible. "I'm not going anywhere," Izuku promised. And in that quiet, heavy room, surrounded by machines and memories, Katsuki let himself believe it might be enough. It was in moments like these that the two were closer than they ever knew how to say. The quiet between them wasn't empty, it was comfortable, grounding. A silence that offered them both a kind of solace words couldn't touch. Their hands remained gently intertwined, and that alone was enough. Even if their signals were mixed. Izuku looked down at Katsuki with soft affection, the kind reserved for someone deeply important, someone cherished. It was the look of someone holding on to a dear friend. So Katsuki thought. Katsuki's perspective? But Katsuki's half-lidded eyes weren't open out of recovery or clarity. They were open for one reason only, to see him. To see Izuku. To catch a glimpse of those stupidly kind, bright green eyes that always looked at him like he was more than his anger, more than his scars. Eyes that he hated for how much he loved them. Eyes that were looking back at him now, steady, warm, and impossibly close. And for once, Katsuki didn't look away. His eyes traced Izuku's face, not in scrutiny, not in challenge, but with something softer, something quieter. Just like he had at the USJ, when everything had begun to spiral, and he caught himself staring instead of bracing for the next blow. Not analyzing. Not calculating. Admiring. It happened again now, unintentionally, unwillingly, but undeniably. Katsuki let himself fall back into that same trance-like state that looking at Izuku always seemed to pull him into. There was a stillness there, a familiarity he hated how badly he needed. His gaze lingered on Izuku's eyes, those wide, impossibly earnest eyes that never seemed to dull. Eyes that always saw too much and forgave even more. Then the freckles, God, those stupid freckles splattered across his face like a stubborn reminder of their childhood. Of the little dots that'd be graced with tear streaks. After a fight with Katsuki, or blood after fighting a villain. Izuku had grown into his features, sharpened with time, with scars and wisdom and heartbreak, but somehow, those freckles still kept him tethered to the boy Katsuki had known for as long as he could remember. The boy he once pushed away. The boy who never left. And now still wouldn't leave. Katsuki's chest ached, but it wasn't from his lungs this time. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just let himself look. Because for this moment, for this one, fleeting breath, he didn't have to hide what he felt. Not from Izuku. Not from himself. He then reflects on the past few hours. When did all this shit start spiraling? He asked himself. A faint memory of what happened, or lack thereof. His mind barely able to piece it all together. It was then through the infirmary window that something caught his eye. The sun's dying rays glistened off the buildings, catching on the glass that lined the window sills, scattering in fractured gold across the city. The orange hue stretched thin as the sun dipped slowly below the horizon. None of the windows held its glow for long. And in that fleeting light, Katsuki realized something he'd been avoiding, something he'd struggled to come to terms with. His earlier efforts to recall what happened faded into the background, overshadowed by this one bitter truth. His grip on Izuku's hand tightened just barely as his gaze lingered on the falling orb of light. Nothing lasts forever. Not the golden gleam of sunlight spilling across Mizudafu's rooftops. Not the rain that painted the sidewalks in silver on quiet evenings. Not even the dream he'd clung to since they were kids, the one where he'd always stay just a step behind Izuku, chasing after him until the very end. This was something he'd have to come to an acceptance with eventually. So why not now? Of all times? Izuku's perspective. He glanced at Katsuki's expression, quiet, pensive as the golden light of the setting sun spilled across his face. It was a far cry from his usual sharp-edged demeanor. There was no fire in his eyes, no scowl tugging at his mouth. Just silence. Stillness. Izuku's worry stirred immediately, thoughts darting too fast to catch. What's going through his head? Why does he look so far away? So focused. Is he in pain again? Is something wrong? There was something fragile in Katsuki's gaze, like he was balancing on the edge of a thought too heavy to carry aloud. And that scared Izuku more than any headline ever could. Yet he remained silent. It was in moments like this that Izuku knew better than to disturb him. If Katsuki needed space to think, Izuku wouldn't get in the way. So he stayed quiet for the sake of that far-off look in Katsuki's eyes, and the thoughts he clearly wasn't ready to share. His hand remained firmly in Katsuki's, anchoring him to the present, a silent reminder that he was there, steady and unwavering, in the quiet way he knew Katsuki understood best. Katsuki didn't speak. But he didn't let go either. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, not heavy. Just full. Charged with things neither of them knew how to say. Maybe they didn't have to. The last sliver of sunlight dipped beneath the horizon, casting the room in soft shadow. The heart monitor kept its steady rhythm. The oxygen hissed gently in time with Katsuki's slow, shallow breaths. Izuku glanced at him again, at the way Katsuki's eyes stayed fixed on the window, even as the light faded. He wasn't sure what the blonde was thinking. Regret, maybe? Fear? Or something deeper? Something quieter? But Izuku didn't push. He just stayed. Because sometimes being there, really being there, meant saying nothing at all. Just holding on. Just letting the other person breathe. Just reminding him he wasn't alone. And in that moment, Katsuki let him. That was enough. Katsuki and Aizawa's perspective, carrot. Some time had passed, and as twilight settled in, the silence inside the infirmary remained unchanged. Still, steady. A fragile calm that hung in the air like a held breath. Beyond the doors, though, chaos churned. Headlines screamed from every screen, speculation ran wild, and the halls of UA buzzed with anxious footsteps and frantic voices. Nearly every member of the former Class 1A had called Aizawa panicked and persistent, demanding answers. Why isn't Midoriya responding? What happened at the USJ? Is it true? Is Bakugo really unconscious? Their concern, while genuine, couldn't change the reality inside the room. Aizawa fielded the panic as best he could. He reassured his former students that Katsuki was alive, stable, just recovering. He promised the press that more information would come soon and, for now, convinced them to back off. Still, several members of Class 1A had asked if they could come see him. They wanted to be there, to see for themselves. But Katsuki didn't ask for anyone. He had Izuku, that was all he needed. He didn't need the noise. Not yet. He simply sat there, quiet and still, eyes fixed on the window. The last traces of daylight had slipped away, replaced by the velvet blue of night. Faint stars blinked behind the city lights, small, distant, but somehow grounding. His fingers were still wrapped around Izuku's hand. Not tight, not desperate, but holding on. And Izuku stayed right there, fingers laced with his, never once letting go. There was more to be said. Maybe not tonight. Maybe not even tomorrow. But something was changing slowly, quietly in the silence they shared. And soon, that silence would have to break. Even in this forming game of unrequited love. The next morning, Katsuki's perspective, for all. Katsuki's eyelids fluttered open to the soft glow of morning light filtering through the sun curtains, casting slow, golden waves across the infirmary walls. Warmth brushed against his skin, not just from the sunlight, but from the familiar hand still cradled in his own. Izuku's. He hadn't left. Not once since everything happened. Katsuki didn't need to be told. He could feel it etched into the tired grip between their palms, in the quiet rise and fall of breath that wasn't his own. Izuku had stayed. And Katsuki couldn't be more grateful. But it was mornings like these, when the world was calm and Izuku was right there, that Katsuki felt himself slipping. Falling. spiraling again into that familiar, dangerous affection. He didn't know if he jumped or if he just tripped, but he was falling back into love with Izuku Midoriya. And it terrified him. He was so FNG screwed. Because the truth was he'd never really fallen out of love. He had just gotten better at hiding it. At folding that soft, vulnerable part of himself into something harder, colder, safer. He learned to hate himself for loving Izuku. How could he love him? How dare he? He who had made him cry. Who had left bruises on Izuku's past, emotional and otherwise. Every tear, every tremble of pain Katsuki had caused was a weight he still carried. How could he ever hope to deserve the kindness in Izuku's eyes? The warmth in his hands? How could someone as broken as him even think about being loved in return? Katsuki swallowed hard, guilt clawing at his throat. He loved Izuku. He always had. And that more than anything was what scared him most. Loving Izuku felt as if standing too close to the sun, blinding, overwhelming, and warm in a way Katsuki didn't think he deserved. It burned sometimes, left scars he didn't know how to name, but he'd take that over the cold emptiness any day. Because no matter how much it hurt, it reminded him he was still capable of feeling something real. That even Katsuki Bakugo, of all people, could be pathetic enough to love someone more than himself. Even so, Izuku didn't deserve to be the one who caught Katsuki's heart. Anyone but him would be better. Izuku shouldn't have to suffer because of Katsuki's selfishness. He deserved the world, the stars, the whole universe. He deserved to fall in love again, to walk forward with certainty, and ultimately leave Katsuki behind to drown in the could-have-beens and ache from all the words left unspoken. The silence that once offered comforting solace now twisted into something suffocating. It crowded Katsuki, filling the quiet room with the weight of his own relentless thoughts. His mind worked overtime, dragging him into memories he didn't want to revisit yet couldn't escape. The human body was a cruel thing. From intrusive thoughts to searing memories, and the looming uncertainty of what was to come, Katsuki felt trapped inside himself, imprisoned in a mind that wouldn't let go. Izuku's hand holding his was a lifeline, and he was grateful for it. But that only made it hurt more. This was all he'd ever get from Izuku. This was all he'd convinced himself he deserved. He knew he should pull back, let the heat and light that Izuku gave off stay at arm's length, if only to avoid getting burned again. But just before the warmth turned scorching, he always felt it, that gentle heat in Izuku's affection, even if it was just friendly. And every time, Katsuki found himself unable to back away. Unable to push Izuku away as he'd previously done. That sheet had worked before. Not in the way he wanted, but it got Izuku to move on. That much Katsuki knew. Still, he couldn't do it again. Not like that. Maybe there was another way. A better way. But if loving Izuku meant letting him go. Right? Wrong. Katsuki Bakugo was too FNG selfish for that. And he knew one day he'd have to face it. Izuku would outpace him in this goddamn race of life and leave him behind again. A new chase was beginning, but this one hurt more than any he'd known. He always thought he'd trail just a step behind Izuku, cheering him on in silence, watching him fulfill dream after dream from just out of reach. Now, the only thing he was chasing was love. And even that felt like a lost cause. It wasn't the rivalry they'd once shared. This was different. This was watching someone slip from your grasp because they were never really yours to hold in the first place. Izuku felt like sand in Katsuki's calloused hands, slipping away, bit by bit. Some part of him clung stubbornly, refusing to let go, while the rest of Izuku had already begun settling into someone else's palm. There was that Dinsing, the one that got away. A pretty way of naming a tragedy. But Katsuki couldn't let that be the story they told. Izuku wasn't just the one who got away, he was everything. And Katsuki couldn't let their relationship rot into a quote. If he was going to lose Izuku, he'd at least keep what little he had left. He'd hold tight to his best friend. To those final grains. Even if it meant Izuku slipped through faster. Even if all that warmth burned. Because those lingering touches, those shared glances that knocked the wind out of him, they were worth the pain. Katsuki knew Izuku would move on. That he'd pour his heart into someone who wasn't him, someone who might treat Izuku the way Katsuki always should have. And still, he couldn't let go. That denial inside him, the mantra of, he's still here, he's still mine, spread like a parasite, multiplying in the cracks Katsuki never let anyone see. He was falling again. And this time, he wasn't sure he'd survive the landing. Izuku's perspective, ew. Sleep didn't come easy. It hadn't for a long time, but especially not now. Even as his body sat still in the chair pulled close to Katsuki's hospital bed, his fingers laced with the hand that had once shoved him, scarred him, saved him, Izuku's mind wouldn't quiet. His breathing was slow, the kind that mimicked rest. But he wasn't really asleep. Not fully. He lingered in that half-placed dream adjacent, maybe where time was foggy and thoughts were louder than reality. Katsuki's hand was warm in his own. Rough, calloused, twitching occasionally. Izuku didn't need to look to know Katsuki was awake. He could feel the subtle changes in his grip, like whispers of emotion the other refused to say aloud. And even in the haze of drowsiness, he felt it. That aching pulse between them. That thing neither of them had the courage to define. Izuku's subconscious clung to it like gravity, like that warmth had been keeping him tethered to this plane, even as the worry and grief threatened to pull him under. He knew Katsuki thought he'd moved on. He hadn't. God, he hadn't. But he'd buried it. Buried it so deep beneath responsibility and rationality and 1,000 shoulds, that it almost looked like healing. Almost. Izuku didn't dream, not really, but there was a flicker behind his eyelids. A memory maybe. Something small. The two of them walking home in middle school, Katsuki trailing a step ahead. The way his silhouette looked in the golden hour. How Izuku had always been just behind him, not by accident but by choice. He was always chasing Katsuki. He just never thought he'd still be chasing him like this. Not for attention. Not for approval. But for something quieter. Gentler. The version of Katsuki he only ever showed when no one else was around. And as Izuku held that worn hand in his own, a tiny furrow between his brows even in sleep, his heart broke in a way no villain ever could have managed. Because no matter how close they sat, there were miles of silence between them. And he didn't know how to cross it without breaking something sacred. But he wanted to. So badly. So he held tighter. Because maybe, just maybe, if he stayed right there, Katsuki wouldn't have to fall alone. And Izuku wouldn't have to keep pretending he wasn't still in love with him. Izuku's entire being had threads tied to Katsuki. The way he stood up for himself now, how he let himself get angry when it mattered, none of that came naturally. Not at first. It wasn't something he learned in a classroom or from pro-hero mentors. It came from Katsuki. Izuku used to think feeling negative emotions, resentment, frustration, rage meant he wasn't worthy of being a hero. That to be a true hero, he had to bottle it all up and smile through it. But then Katsuki came along, loud, unfiltered, and honest in a way that cut deep. And somewhere along the way, Izuku started listening. He hated it at first. Hated how much Katsuki's voice echoed in his own head. But then, he started understanding. It was okay to feel. It was okay to burn. Even if the flame looked a little too much like his. He used to chase villains with the same sharp edge Katsuki did, eyes narrowed, fists clenched, voice hard. His idea of victory began to twist into something that felt more like his, until he realized the truth. Victory meant nothing if it didn't save lives. And saving lives meant nothing if you couldn't win. Or something like that. That line, victory is hollow without saving lives, and saving lives is impossible without winning, had come from Katsuki himself. Not during a battle. Not during a press conference. But 8 years after graduation, when they were sitting at the back of the bar during their Class 1A reunion. Casual. Often. Almost forgotten. But it stayed with Izuku. Like everything Katsuki gave him, even the things he never meant to. Izuku and Katsuki's perspective, understood. And so, as the morning rays grew brighter, spilling gold across the infirmary walls, Izuku and Katsuki began to understand just how royally fed they truly were. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was thick with all the things they hadn't said, couldn't say. Because somewhere, buried beneath every stubborn glance and quiet gesture, was the truth they both carried like a ticking bomb. They were both teetering at the edge, balanced on the precipice of a single phrase. I love you. And yet they knew God, They knew how easily those 3 words could unravel everything. How simple syllables could burn down what fragile ground they'd finally built between them. To love each other wasn't the issue. It was what that love could cost. And neither of them was ready to pay the price. Not yet. Izuku and Katsuki's perspectives the whole time. I'm too lazy to keep doing this, _it. The sunlight was warmer now. Not blinding, not sterile, just there, brushing gently against Katsuki's skin as if trying to coax him into peace. It spilled through the infirmary curtains in soft waves, warming the bedsheets and catching in the strands of his hair. He didn't move much. He didn't need to. Because Izuku was still there. Head bowed slightly, eyes heavy with sleep, hands still wrapped tightly in Katsuki's like it belonged there. His other hand rested against the mattress, fingertips just barely brushing the hem of Katsuki's blanket, like he needed to be touching him at all times to know he was real. Katsuki stared. He didn't say anything. Not yet. His throat still ached, and his ribs burned if he tried to shift too far. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was that Izuku hadn't left. He hadn't gotten scared off, hadn't run when Katsuki broke apart right in front of him. And Katsuki, as much as he hated the mess he was, hated the idea of anyone seeing him so fragile, found himself unable to look away. His thumb twitched, just barely rubbing the back of Izuku's hand. Izuku stirred at the motion. His eyes opened slowly, blurry at first, and then wide with soft realization when they locked with Katsuki's. "Hey," Izuku said, voice rough with sleep. Katsuki didn't respond at first. He just blinked, slow and tired, then let his gaze drop to their hands. "You stayed," he muttered. Izuku's lips tugged into a crooked smile. "Of course I did." Silence stretched between them for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just full. "Waited." Katsuki exhaled, sharp and quiet. "You're an idiot." Izuku's smile didn't falter. "So you've told me since we were 4. Katsuki rolled his eyes, but his grip didn't loosen. If anything, it tightened just slightly, like his body didn't know how to let go even if his pride told him to. The morning sun crept higher, casting golden light across the walls. And for a moment, Katsuki forgot about the headlines he knew were brimming. The eyes. The hospital machines. He only saw him. Green eyes still heavy with concern, freckles dusted across his cheeks like constellations Katsuki could name in his sleep. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't stifling. It was soft, fragile, and Izuku, Katsuki said, his voice barely above a whisper, "You don't have to keep doing this." Izuku tilted his head. "Doing what?" "This." Katsuki looked down again. "Staying. Holding on." Izuku was quiet for a second. "But you don't get to decide that for me." Katsuki looked back up, and in Izuku's expression, there was no hesitation. Only quiet certainty. That same stubborn warmth Katsuki had both hated and loved for years. "You didn't let go," Izuku said softly. "So I won't either." Katsuki looked away. He wanted to say something, anything. Wanted to curse, or scoff, or call him a dumb nerd again just to cut through the weight in his chest. But he couldn't. Not when Izuku looked at him like that. So instead, he let his hand stay exactly where it was twined with Izuku's, resting between them like a fragile truth. And for the first time in a long time, Katsuki didn't feel like he had to run. Not that he ever really could not from Izuku. Even when he tried, when he wanted to tear the thread that bound them, to put distance between them just long enough to breathe, it never broke. The tension held, taut and trembling. Reluctant. Inevitable. No matter what they faced, no matter how far they pulled, the universe kept them sewn together by its sick humor. Knotted together by the weight of everything they never said, shared past, and something neither of them had. The guts to name out loud. Katsuki wanted to curse whatever cosmic force kept throwing them into each other's orbit. But a part of him wanted to thank it too. Because he and Izuku had become experts at this back and forth rhythm. Tug-of-war. Push and pull. Pretending they didn't care while clinging with white knuckles to the pieces they never let go of. They couldn't be together. Katsuki knew that. Izuku deserved everything. And Katsuki deserved less. So even now, as they walked this jagged path, only the two of them could understand, even if it took weeks, months, years, decades, even they would unravel it. Thread by thread. Knot by knot. Just enough to take one step back. Just enough to finally let go. But there was no clean escape. No other angle to view this from. They were built to break each other. And made to hold each other together, too. Time skip, around 9 p.m. that night. By now, Katsuki was able to move more easily and had been cleared to leave the infirmary. He couldn't drive himself, so Izuku offered to take him home. Only they'd have to walk since Izuku lived only 2 miles away. Katsuki still needed to recover and had to be kept under a watchful eye, but Recovery Girl had other students to attend to. They agreed on a compromise. Katsuki would stay at Izuku's apartment for the time being. As they walked down the halls of UA, passing a crowd of concerned faces, both felt almost numb. Everything leading up to their exit from the UA gates was a blur. Nothing seemed to register except the presence of the other. They fell into a quiet silence, no calls, no messages, and only the occasional word exchanged every hour or so. There was so much spoken, and yet even more left unspoken. They were tangled in the past like broken strings. Each pull only makes the knot tighter, and yet, neither of the two had the strength to cut it loose. Too many knots tangled in their relationship, bumps in the thread that never let them drift too far apart. If they ever wanted to truly let go, they'd have to carefully unravel those knots, pulling at the strands until there was enough distance to finally step away, until they became the strangers they might be years from now. And so, beneath the moon's quiet disapproval, they passed through the UA gates and turned away from the familiar path they had taken to arrive on campus. They didn't speak as their footsteps echoed softly on the pavement, the silence between them thick yet strangely comforting. The weight of everything unsaid lingered like a ghost, but neither pushed to fill the space. Katsuki's eyes flicked to Izuku now and then, catching the faintest hint of exhaustion shadowing his features. Izuku's jaw was set, steady as ever, but Katsuki could feel the quiet storm beneath the unyielding determination to stay, to fight, to not let go. For a moment, Katsuki wondered if maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to unravel every knot. Maybe some threads were meant to hold, even if imperfectly. The city lights flickered around them, casting long shadows as the night deepened. The path ahead was uncertain, tangled with pain and hope in equal measure, but together, they kept moving forward one step at a time. And that, for now, was enough. They covered the 2-mile walk to Izuku's apartment fairly quickly. Since Katsuki's discharge, a heavy silence had settled over them like a weight on their shoulders. With the assignment postponed and Izuku granted days off to make sure Katsuki was okay, a massive chunk of the stress he'd been carrying for over 36 hours or so was finally lifted. Meanwhile, Katsuki kicked aside the occasional rock on the sidewalk, his mind drifting back to the same troubling thoughts. He was truly F'd. This was unrequited. It had to be. Izuku had moved on as he should have. Katsuki kept telling himself that. The sick hope that things might be different would only send him spiraling deeper than he already was. At every crosswalk, the all-too-familiar sidewalk gave them a brief pause. Izuku pulled his keys from the surprisingly deep pockets of his suit jacket. His usually crisp suit was rumpled from the restless sleep he'd had in the infirmary, sitting by Katsuki's side, or, rather, the lack thereof that wasn't important. Katsuki's well-being was. So he walked home with a purpose he hadn't realized he'd been lacking. Whether he sounded like some overbearing mother hen didn't matter. He was going to take care of Katsuki, pester him if he had to. Katsuki's life was that important to Izuku. He knew how badly Katsuki wanted to dive back into battles and stop crimes, not that Izuku would let him out of his sight anytime soon, so he was determined to make this recovery as swift as possible. He wanted Katsuki back in the field. Katsuki was now the #1 hero in his place, so he'd better get his butt moving. And so, after walking up a couple flights of stairs, Izuku unlocked the door to his apartment and welcomed Katsuki into his humble abode. The soft click of the door closing behind them felt heavier than usual, like a barrier separating the chaos outside from the fragile quiet within. Katsuki stepped in slowly, his eyes sweeping across the unfamiliar surroundings with a tired, almost vulnerable gaze. The apartment smelled faintly of herbs and old paper books, probably, and felt warm in a way that sharply contrasted with the cold, sterile walls of the infirmary. Izuku watched him carefully, silently monitoring for any sign of discomfort or fatigue. "You can sleep in my room," Izuku offered, already moving toward the hallway. "I'll take the couch, yeah?" Katsuki didn't answer, not with words, at least. Izuku's gentle prompt hadn't quite settled in his chest, not yet. So he just nodded and bent down to unlace his boots at the entrance, eyes still adjusting to the soft, lived-in clutter of Izuku's home. He felt disgusting. His hair was matted from the infirmary bed, his hero costume still clung to his skin, and he could feel the stale sweat lingering like a second layer. Izuku led the way into his medium-sized bedroom, with Katsuki trailing behind. The space was lived in, but clean shelves lined with books and hero memorabilia, a green throw blanket draped over the bed, and graphic pillows nestled at the head. Katsuki's gaze wandered, absorbing the small details of a place that, somehow, felt too NTMT familiar, even for his first time there. He hovered near the doorway, hesitant to sit on the bed. He might be rough around the edges, but he was considerate enough. Izuku was already rummaging through a drawer, humming to himself. "Hey, what size shirt are you wearing these days?" Katsuki glanced around again, his sharp ruby eyes landing on a small balcony just beyond the glass doors. Pots of flowers lined the edges, a modest garden of color in the quiet night. His eyes softened briefly at the sight of lilies of the valley, Izuku's favorite. He remembered, and gladiolus, tall and unapologetic. But I'm guessing you only have mediums." Izuku laughed, an actual laugh, light and genuine, probably the first one in hours. "You know me too well. But I've got some larges too. Nothing wrong with a good oversized shirt." He tossed a folded All Might shirt over his shoulder, and it hit Katsuki square in the chest. "Same for pants? It's freezing tonight, so take these." He then grabbed some fresh boxers and said, "Figured you'd need a new pair." He handed over a pair of large gray sweatpants and the newly cleaned boxers, surprisingly casual in contrast to how tense everything had felt earlier. Katsuki let out a tired huff, gathering the clothes in his arms before trudging into the bathroom that branched off from Izuku's bedroom. Inside, he peeled off his armor piece by piece: neck guard, gloves, knee guards, utility belt, finally his headpiece, and then, reluctantly, the clinging fabric of his hero suit. His skin sighed in relief, sore and aching after days trapped under that suffocating uniform. Now alone in the still air of Izuku's bathroom, clad only in his boxer briefs, Katsuki glanced at the shirt for a moment before taking the final piece of fabric off. He stepped into the shower, setting the clothes he'd been lent to the side momentarily, as he closed the thin glass door to capture the showerhead's water. Katsuki, as expected, loved a piping hot shower. The kind that stung bruises and revived the pain in cuts he had no idea he had. It felt oddly similar to that of Izuku's scorching glow. Even if a mere metaphor Katsuki had come up with. The small moments like this always tracked back to Izuku. Even the innocent heat of the shower's tears running down his scarred body. He cleaned the grime and sweat off his tired figure and dried off, rubbing a towel to his spiky hair, that'd soon puff up to its usual volume. He slipped on the boxers that had been lent to him, as well as the gray sweatpants. Then settling on the shirt. Despite calling it oversized, the shirt fit him like a glove. Of all the shirts Izuku still had, it had to be this one. Light blue, with a bold graphic of All Might's iconic silhouette plastered across the front. Katsuki stared at himself in the mirror for a moment, then snorted softly. That DMN shirt. He and Izuku had practically gone to war for it. The memory hit him hard and fast, a scorching Saturday in mid-June. The night before, they'd taken Katsuki's car and driven across town to the release event for limited edition All Might merch. True fanboys, they brought blankets, camped out in the parking lot, and slept in the car to be first in line. Of course, so had hundreds of others. Still, they'd woken up 3 hours earlier than necessary, fueled by pure nerdy determination. A few others had joined the front of the line, but none of them had the same hunger. When the doors opened, it was chaos. A sea of limbs surged forward, and Katsuki, Izuku, and that small pack at the front dove into the fray. They managed to grab a ton of merch, but the real prize, the real battle, was for those DMN shirts. Katsuki remembered it clearly, Izuku balling up 2 shirts in his arms and hurling them across the crowd to Katsuki just as he was being swallowed by the swarm. Katsuki caught them like his life depended on it and bolted, barely holding onto them as people tried yanking them from his grip. He paid and sprinted outside like a man possessed. Izuku came out minutes later breathless and covered in little scratches from being stampeded, arms full of last-minute grabs. They'd laughed themselves sick explaining to their classmates why they looked like they'd been mauled by zombies and carried enough all-might gear to start a museum. The memory warmed Katsuki from the inside out. He chuckled quietly to himself, snapping out of it only when there was a soft knock on the bathroom door. Knock knock. You all right in there? Izuku's voice was quiet, uncertain, like he didn't want to intrude, but couldn't help checking in. Katsuki opened the door, steam slipping out behind him as he held his used towel on his arm, and stepped into the bedroom again. His damp hair stuck slightly to his forehead, the sweatpants sitting low on his hips, and the all-might shirt framing him in nostalgia. Yeah, he muttered. Thanks. Izuku gave him a once-over subtle, but not hidden. Izuku himself had been wearing a random band shirt with some black baggy sweatpants. The tension in his shoulders eased. Shirt still fits, he said, a soft smile tugging at his mouth. Guess you didn't shrink it in the wash, Katsuki replied, then added under his breath, miracle. Izuku huffed a laugh, stepping aside. I made tea if you want any. It's nothing fancy, just chamomile. Good for nerves or whatever. Katsuki didn't respond immediately, but he followed him out into the kitchen anyway. The apartment was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the city bleeding in through the windows. Izuku handed him the warm mug wordlessly, and Katsuki accepted it, wrapping his hands around the ceramic like it might ground him. They stood there in the silence for a moment, just breathing, sipping, and letting the hum of the world outside fade to nothing. You didn't have to let me stay here, Katsuki said eventually, voice low and a bit rough. Izuku looked at him, startled. Of course I did. No, I mean, Katsuki paused, jaw working like the words were reluctant to be spoken. You didn't owe me anything. Izuku leaned against the kitchen counter, staring down into his tea. It's not about owing. You're important to me, Katsuki. That's it. Katsuki didn't respond. He couldn't, not right now. His throat was too tight and his chest too full. Izuku took a slow sip, then gestured toward his bedroom. If you want a thicker blanket, there's one in the closet. You're not sleeping on the couch. Izuku blinked. What? Katsuki looked up at him, dead serious. You don't have to play the martyr, Izuku. It's your bed. I can sleep on the floor. Izuku looked like he was about to protest, but then he caught something in Katsuki's expression, some old, frayed edge of pride that hadn't quite healed yet, and sighed. All right, he said. Gently. We'll share. Katsuki's eyelids fluttered in utter shock. Huh. Izuku's cheeks now held a tinge of pink, scratching the back of his neck. I mean, it's a double bed. We've done worse during training camps. Remember when we had to share a sleeping bag during that blizzard in 3rd year? Katsuki groaned. Don't remind me. Remembering the stupid graduation camp trip Class 1A indulged in only for it to go to sheets with a blizzard to grace their DMN side of the Gunga Mountain Villa. Izuku chuckled. Then it's fine. Seriously. I trust you not to kick me in your sleep. No promises. That earned another quiet laugh, and after they lazily put their cups on the counter, Izuku turned off the kitchen light, the apartment falling into deeper shadows as they made their way back to the bedroom. After brushing their teeth in an awkward position over the sink they now had to share, they got into bed without much ceremony, Katsuki on one side, Izuku on the other. A respectful distance between them. The mattress dipped slightly beneath their weight, the covers cool against their skin. It was quiet. Unnervingly so. Then Katsuki exhaled momentarily before turning to face Izuku. That shirt. Do you remember how close we were to getting trampled that day? Izuku snorted into his pillow as he leaned his head on his hand. You mean you getting trampled while I played quarterback and launched limited edition merch over the crowd? Katsuki smirked, eyes closing. I still have the scars. Worth it. Katsuki didn't respond, but the silence that followed was different. Softer. Less hollow. A few minutes passed before Izuku spoke again, his voice barely audible in the dark. I'm glad you're here. Katsuki's chest tightened a hint. Yeah, he muttered. Me too. And with that, their eyelids fluttered shut. At least Izuku's did. Katsuki lay still, eyes wide open in the dark. He could hear Izuku's breathing slow, even, the kind of rhythm you only slipped into when you trusted the space you were in. When you felt safe. Katsuki didn't know when that had become something Izuku associated him with again. The bed was warm. Too warm. Not because of the blankets, but because of the proximity. Because he could feel the heat radiating from Izuku's side, steady and unbothered, and it made his own pulse feel erratic in comparison. He stared at the ceiling, every blink slow, every breath deliberate. That diamond shirt stretched softly over his chest, still smelling faintly like Izuku's detergent and lilies, specifically spider lilies, one of Katsuki's favorites. Everything felt too loud in the quiet. The creak of the bed frame, the hum of the refrigerator, the ache in his ribs that had nothing to do with injury. And the weight of those words, I'm glad you're here. Katsuki turned his head slightly, watching Izuku in the dark. His face was turned toward him, slack with sleep. One arm was curled under the pillow, the other resting just inches away between them. Close enough to reach. To hold. He didn't. He couldn't. Because the truth clawed at the back of his throat like it always did. He didn't know how much longer he could hold this inside. This ache. This need. This want. Izuku had moved on. Katsuki was sure of it. The world had chewed them up and spit them out more than once. And still, somehow, Izuku remained the sun. And Katsuki. The burn. He turned onto his back again, eyes closing against the weight pressing on his chest. He didn't want to ruin this, whatever this was. A moment of peace. Of closeness. Even if it was borrowed. But God, it would be so easy to ruin it. A single confession. A whispered, I still love you. A touch that lingered too long. He couldn't risk it. Couldn't risk pushing Izuku away again, not when Izuku was finally here, as they sleep in the same bed, not flinching away from the damage Katsuki couldn't always hide. So he stayed still. Silent. Tethered by something he didn't have the courage to name. And in the quiet, as sleep finally threatened to pull him under, Katsuki let his hand drift just barely until his fingers brushed against Izuku's knuckles. He didn't intertwine them. He didn't dare. But Izuku's fingers twitched in response, even in sleep. And stayed there. Touching. Present. Together, for now. Not nearly enough to spill in replacement for the ache in his chest. The hours bled together after that. Neither stirred, though neither slept all that deeply either. Morning came in slowly, painting the room in hues of quiet gold. The curtains filtered the light, casting soft shadows across Izuku's face where he lay still, hand now fully touching Katsuki somehow. Sometime in the night, their fingers had found each other again. Katsuki wasn't sure who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was Izuku. But it didn't matter now. He blinked against the sun and let his gaze settle on the lines of Izuku's face. Softer when he slept. His brows weren't furrowed like usual, and the curve of his mouth was relaxed, almost smiling. It hit Katsuki all at once how fing unfair it was, to love someone this much and not know what to do with it. His thumb ghosted across the back of Izuku's hand. Izuku stirred. Of course he did, he was a light sleeper anyways. Eyes fluttered open slowly, sleep-heavy, confused for only a second until he realized what day it was. Where they were. Who he was looking at. Morning, Izuku murmured, voice hoarse and laced with sleep. Katsuki gave a quiet nod. Mornings. Izuku hummed, stretching his legs beneath the blanket. What time is it? No idea. A beat passed. You okay? Izuku asked. It was quiet for a second too long. Katsuki turned his face slightly toward Izuku, who was watching him now as he sat up, brow creased just a little. Define, okay, Katsuki muttered. Izuku gave him a look. The one that said, don't bullshit me, even if he didn't say it out loud. Katsuki sighed. I've been worse. Not exactly a ringing endorsement, Izuku murmured, but it wasn't sarcastic. It was gentle. Sad almost. He scooted out of the blanket, running a hand through his tangled hair. The blanket slipped from his shoulder, and Katsuki tried not to stare at the fading marks on his arm's scars from battles neither of them had time to process. Izuku swung his legs off the bed. "I'll make breakfast." "You don't have to." "I know," Izuku said over his shoulder, already moving toward the door. "But I want to." The sound of his bare feet padding across the wooden floor faded into the soft clink of dishes and the hiss of a burner flicking on. Katsuki stayed in bed a little longer, his hand curling into the still warm sheets where Izuku had just been. It didn't make sense. This care. This closeness. The way Izuku had always made him feel like he wasn't too much, even when he knew he was. Eventually, he stood and followed the faint smell of eggs and toast into the kitchen. Izuku was already plating food, the collar of his wrinkled sleep shirt drooping off one shoulder. He glanced over. "Didn't think you'd get up yet?" "Didn't feel like being alone." Izuku paused. Their eyes met. Katsuki looked away first. Izuku didn't say anything to that. He just nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and returned to the toast, flipping a slice onto the plate with practiced ease. The silence that followed wasn't tense, it was warm, lived in. Like steam rising from a mug between them. Katsuki leaned against the doorway, arms crossed loosely over his chest. His throat felt tight, like there was too much he wanted to say and nowhere safe to put it. He didn't know how to thank someone for something like this, for not leaving. For making toast. For just being here. "Sit," Izuku said gently, as he slid the plate to Katsuki from across the counter. Katsuki did, dragging the stool out with a quiet scrape of wood on tile. The plate was simple, just eggs, toast, a few pieces of sliced fruit, but the effort behind it sat heavier than anything fancy. He picked up a fork, not quite looking at Izuku. He stared at it for a second too long. Izuku finally sat, cradling his mug in both hands. "Eat," he said, quieter now. "Before it gets cold." Katsuki picked up his fork. They ate in a slow, comfortable silence, the only sounds the soft scrape of utensils and the occasional clink of ceramic. No words were needed. Not yet. But eventually, Izuku broke the quiet again. "You can stay here as long as you want." Katsuki paused mid-bite. "I mean it," Izuku added, eyes still fixed on his plate. "You don't have to pretend you're fine." "Not with me." Katsuki chewed, swallowed. Set his fork down. "You make it sound easy," he muttered. Izuku finally looked at him. "It's not. But that's why I'm saying it out loud." And demon it, there was again that feeling Katsuki kept trying to shove down. The one that made his chest ache and his voice catch. The one that whispered maybe it wasn't unrequited after all. Maybe he wasn't the only one who'd been holding on. Demon it. Even now, when Izuku hadn't done anything extraordinary, just made him breakfast like any good friend, would Katsuki still let himself feel it? That flicker of something he hated admitting to. All it took was eggs and toast, and somehow, Katsuki was seeing the best of Izuku all over again. They sat together at the small kitchen table, knees nearly bumping, forks clinking quietly, the silence between them no longer heavy, just present. Alive in its own quiet way. Izuku didn't fill the space with small talk. He didn't press. He just ate beside Katsuki like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe, Katsuki realized, it was. Maybe this was what it looked like healing. Not in big, sweeping moments, but in the ones that barely registered until they passed. Burnt edges of toast. The steady rhythm of someone breathing beside you. The warmth of a home that still somehow welcomed you back. When they were finished, Izuku stood to rinse the dishes, and Katsuki found himself watching him again, shoulders relaxed, the soft hum of a tune under his breath. Katsuki didn't say thank you. The words stuck somewhere behind his teeth, too heavy to force out. But he didn't leave. He stayed, quietly, stubbornly, like his presence could say what his mouth couldn't. And maybe, just maybe, Izuku heard it anyway.